Hello friends, I am Mr. Ghost, and I am here to help you today. I know, you use these videos to fall asleep. So, before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I'm not a guy who believes in ghosts or hidden passages. I never cared about old urban legends, and I never felt uneasy in dark rooms. When I first moved into my new apartment, I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. The place looked clean, the building seemed stable, and the neighbors were polite. Everything seemed in order. But on the first night, I noticed something strange in the hallway. There's a section between two walls that doesn't line up with the rest of the floor plan. It's not part of a closet, it's not a pipe duct, and there's no door or service hatch. It's just an awkward space that doesn't have a clear purpose. At first I thought it might be some sort of design choice. Maybe the architect forgot to align the walls. But that doesn't explain the weird things I began to hear once the lights went out. I settled in around midnight. I was exhausted from carrying boxes and rearranging furniture. I left most of the stuff in the living room and set up just the basics in my bedroom. A bed frame, a mattress, and a small lamp. The apartment was quiet, and the street outside was pretty still too. I didn't have the TV set up yet, so there was no background noise other than my own footsteps and the faint sound of my fridge kicking on and off. After brushing my teeth, I walked down the short hallway to my bedroom. That's when I heard a soft shuffling noise behind the wall on my left. It was so subtle that I paused for a moment, thinking it might be in my head. But it sounded like footsteps, tiny padded steps, like someone was walking around in a small space. My heart gave a small jolt. It was unexpected. But I convinced myself it was just the pipes or the building settling. I climbed into bed and tried to push it out of my mind. About 10 minutes later, I started drifting off. Then I heard something else. This time, it sounded like a muffled whisper followed by a faint thump. I opened my eyes. My bedroom shares the wall with the corridor, and that corridor has this weird gap. I lay there holding my breath, listening. The noise came again. A soft scuffling sound, like feet dragging against concrete or dusty wood. I felt a twinge in my stomach. I got up, walked into the hallway, and pressed my ear against the wall. The surface felt cool, but after a few seconds I felt a slight rush of hot air brush against my cheek. There's no vent there. There's no reason for hot air to seep out. My mouth went dry. I decided to grab a flashlight from one of my unpacked boxes. I aimed it around the hallway, looking for any cracks or hidden seams. Nothing. Just white paint and smooth plaster. I knocked on the wall. It sounded solid, but maybe there was a hollow area behind it. The building manager didn't mention any sealed-off rooms though. I told myself it had to be an odd ventilation duct or an unused service corridor. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep well. The next morning I called a friend of mine, Jeff, who works in construction. I asked him if older buildings sometimes have weird structural gaps. He said they do, but usually there's a reason. He told me to look for access panels or old fuse boxes. After we hung up, I looked around more carefully. There was no panel or door. The space between the two walls was about 1.5 feet wide, maybe 6 or 7 feet tall, running the length of the corridor. It didn't connect to any known closet or utility room. All day I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept hearing those muffled noises in my head, replaying them as I tried to figure out what they could be. Footsteps, whispering. It sounded like a person walking around, but who would be in there? There's no way, in or out, that I can see. Around lunchtime, I pressed my ear to the wall again. It was silent. Nothing. When I knocked, it sounded hollow, but I still couldn't find a seam. I spent the afternoon unpacking, setting up my TV, my couch, and my coffee table. I played music to distract myself, but I caught myself glancing over toward that spot in the hallway every few minutes. I guess I was hoping I might see a crack appear, or a door handle or something that would give me a clue. I started to feel tense. My chest felt tight, and my hands got clammy whenever I thought about it. At one point, I considered calling the building manager to ask more questions, but I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I decided to handle it on my own. That night, I tried to ignore the hallway. I cooked a quick dinner, watched some TV, then got ready for bed. While I was brushing my teeth, I heard a low thud coming from that same wall. I froze, toothbrush still in my mouth. Well, then I heard something like a shuffle, moving away from the spot near the bathroom and heading toward the living room wall. I turned off the water, and listened. The noise traveled like someone was dragging their feet along an enclosed path. My hands trembled. I spat out the toothpaste, wiped my mouth, and mumbled to myself, "What the hell is that?" I stepped into the hallway, flicked on the overhead light, and pressed my ear against the wall again. The noises kept shifting position, like we were playing cat and mouse. Whenever I moved to one side of the wall, the sounds seemed to drift to the other end. At one point I thought I heard shallow, irregular breathing, like someone trying to be quiet but failing. My heart pounded so hard that I could feel my pulse throbbing in my neck. My scalp tingled, and I felt sweat forming under my arms. I looked around for something to pry open the wall, but I didn't have any serious tools yet. I only had a small toolbox with a hammer, a couple of screwdrivers, and a set of wrenches. I considered smashing a hole through the drywall, but I worried about damaging the wiring or pipes. I also worried about what I might find. The thought sent a chill up my spine, but I couldn't ignore it. I decided to at least remove a portion of the baseboard and see if there was an access point behind it. I spent about 30 minutes carefully prying the baseboard in the hallway. Beneath it, I found a narrow gap between the floor and the wall's base. The gap was too thin to see anything. I tried shining my flashlight through it. I didn't see much, just darkness. I thought I caught a glimpse of some sort of rough concrete behind there, but it was impossible to get a clear view. When I got down on my knees and pressed my ear to that gap, I could feel a puff of warm air blow against my face. That made my stomach clench. There shouldn't be any air circulation there. I stayed up late that night, pacing around, listening to the faint movements. At times I heard scratching like nails against drywall. Then it stopped. Around 3 in the morning I finally fell asleep on the couch, fully dressed. I woke up the next day with a stiff neck and a sense of dread. I decided I needed to take more drastic measures. I made a plan to cut a small hole in the drywall, just big enough to peek inside. I stopped by a hardware store and picked up a drywall saw, a larger flashlight, and some protective gloves. The clerk didn't ask me any questions, and I wasn't in the mood to chat anyway. Back at the apartment, I spent a while measuring the section of the wall that felt hollow when I knocked on it. I tried to choose a spot that was less likely to have electrical wiring. After some careful tapping and listening, I found an area that sounded clear. My heart was racing so hard I thought I might pass out. My palms were sweaty and my throat felt tight. I kept reminding myself to breathe normally. When I started sawing, the noise echoed in the hallway. It made me jumpy. Every little screech made me glance around, worried I might trigger some sort of response from the other side. I kept going, stopping every so often to listen. After a few minutes I made a small rectangular cut in the drywall, about 4 inches by 4 inches. I shined my flashlight inside. I saw a narrow gap, maybe a foot or so in width. Just like I suspected, the surfaces on the inside were rough cement and wooden beams. The space extended in both directions, running parallel to my hallway. I leaned in closer. The flashlight's beam revealed a dusty floor and some debris, like bits of plaster and old insulation. Then I heard a shuffle to my left, deeper in that dark passage. My heart pounded, and I almost dropped the flashlight. I pulled back, pressing my back against the opposite hallway wall. I stood there for a good 10 seconds, not breathing. When I finally gathered enough courage to look again, I didn't see any movement. There was no figure, no shape, just the same dusty interior. But that hot air brushed my face again like someone exhaling near the hole. My chest tightened, and my knees started shaking. I couldn't speak, I just stared into that darkness, feeling my eyes sting from not blinking. I moved the flashlight beam around, trying to see if there was any sign of a hidden door or a small ladder. The passage looked uneven. In some places it got wider, but it never looked big enough for a person to stand upright. Still, the noises I'd heard suggested otherwise. I heard a tap to my right, like a knuckle on concrete. I jerked my head in that direction and shone the light toward the corner. Nothing was there, just blackness and a flicker of dust in the beam. I wanted to call the building manager right then and demand an explanation, but a part of me felt too unsettled to let anyone else in on this yet. I didn't want to be labeled as the crazy new tenant. I also felt a weird sense that this was my problem to solve. I decided to seal the hole for the night. I taped a piece of cardboard over it and told myself I'd decide what to do in the morning. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined something crawling through that small opening, lurking in the corridor. Around 2 a.m., I heard more footsteps, I crept into the hallway with my flashlight. I stood there, my muscles tense, trying to track the sounds. They moved behind the wall from one end to the other, like pacing. Then they stopped near the living room side. I tiptoed into the living room and pressed my ear to the wall. A soft rasp came from the other side, and then a strange tapping started. My hair stood on end. I whispered, "Hello?" I didn't expect a response, but I said it anyway. The tapping paused, then continued. My chest felt like it was locked in a vice. I ended up back on my couch again, drifting in and out of a light sleep. Every small creak in the apartment jolted me awake. At some point, dawn light began filtering through the windows. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and walked over to the hallway. The cardboard was still in place. I gave the piece of drywall ID cut a wary look. Nothing had disturbed it during the night, as far as I could tell. I peeled back the tape and took another peek inside. This time, I didn't see anything unusual, just a dark gap with dust motes floating around. I started thinking about the actual structure of the building. Maybe there was an old ventilation shaft in there that someone had used at some point. Maybe a vagrant had found a way in from the outside. But I'm on the 5th floor, that makes no sense. I spent a long time pacing around my apartment, trying to work up the nerve to go in deeper. The hole I made wasn't big enough to squeeze through. I'd have to cut out a much larger section of drywall to even get one shoulder inside. That idea made my stomach tighten. I didn't like the idea of crawling into a dark space with no clear exit. By mid-afternoon, I had convinced myself to enlarge the hole. I told myself I needed answers. I didn't want to spend another night listening to whatever was behind that wall. So, I used the saw to cut a hole big enough to fit through if I really had to. The process took me a while. Every few minutes I stopped to listen. No new sounds. Once the hole was large enough, I shined my flashlight inside again. The air felt stale and warm. I could feel beads of sweat forming on my forehead. I carefully slid one foot inside, resting it on the dusty floor behind the wall. It felt solid. I ducked my head through the opening. The flashlight revealed a tight passage that went about 10 feet in either direction, curving slightly behind the bedroom and living room walls. It was cramped, lined with old studs and scattered insulation. I could stand hunched over but couldn't straighten up. My breath sounded too loud in my ears. I shuffled to the left first, stepping over debris. My heart hammered with each step. I held the flashlight with a trembling hand, scanning the corners in the base of the wall. After about 5 feet, I found a small pile of old newspapers. They looked decades old. The print was faded. I didn't see anything else. No footprints, no recent trash. Then I heard a scraping sound behind me, near the opening. I spun around so fast that I nearly lost my balance. The flashlight beam shook. Nothing was there, but I caught a flicker of movement on the right side of the passage, the side I hadn't explored yet. I felt a sudden rush of heat, like the entire passage got warmer by a few degrees. I crept back toward the opening, paused to steady my nerves, and then moved to the right side. The gap stretched behind the living room wall. About 5 feet in, I found a narrow vent that led somewhere downward. It was maybe the size of a large shoebox. I crouched next to it and aimed the flashlight inside. I couldn't see the end. It dropped into darkness. Then I heard that whisper again, so close to my ear that I gasped. I twisted around, shining the light in every direction. No one was there. My legs were shaking. I felt a surge of panic. My breathing grew shallow. I turned and stumbled back toward the opening in my wall, almost scraping my shoulder on a protruding nail. Once I made it out, I staggered into my hallway, heart pounding, sweat running down my face. I sealed the hole again, this time using extra cardboard and some nails. I don't know what's inside that passage. I don't know who or what might be lurking behind my walls. All I know is that I can't live here much longer without real answers. The noises, the shifting footsteps, the strange rushes of hot air. It all feels too real to dismiss. I haven't told the building manager yet, but I'm running out of time. Tonight, he'll probably hear more footsteps. And tomorrow, I'll have to decide whether I'm going to knock down more drywall or if I'm going to pack up and leave. I'm not a guy who's easily scared, but this situation has me on edge in a way I've never experienced before. I can feel the tension in my chest, and every time I think about that hidden space, my pulse speeds up. I don't know what's behind those walls, but it's not staying quiet, and I'm not sure how much more I can handle. I moved into this loft in an old building last month. I chose it because the rent was low, and the space was large enough for my work equipment. The landlord mentioned that the building was famous for its spiral staircase. He said it was the original design from when the place was a factory decades ago. I didn't think much of that detail at first. I just needed a place to live. Now I wish I'd asked more questions about that staircase, especially why it looks the way it does at night. My loft is on the 3rd floor. The spiral staircase sits in the center of the building, going from the ground floor all the way up to the 6th. The first time I walked up those steps, I noticed how narrow they were, and how every step made a creaking noise. The sound is sharp and unpleasant. It's not like a gentle squeak you might hear in a normal old house. It's more like a strained groan. I guess it's the old wood. The railing is iron, and it's cold to the touch even during the day. The walls around the staircase have peeling paint, and there's a faint smell of dampness. It looks neglected, but it still stands strong. I settled in with some simple furniture, a bed in one corner, a small desk by the window, and a couch facing the door. The place has high ceilings and large windows. During the day, the sunlight pours in, and everything seems fine. But at night, the building gets quiet. The neighbors don't make much noise, and there's almost no traffic outside after 10. Sometimes I hear pipes humming behind the walls, but that's it. The silence gets unsettling, especially around midnight. I usually stay up late, working on my computer or watching something on my laptop. Sometimes I take a break and walk to the vending machine in the lobby. That's when I first noticed something weird on the staircase. One night I was heading down around 1 a.m. As I reached the stairs and looked down the center, there's a gap in the middle of the spiral where you can see all the way to the bottom. The overhead light was on, but it was dim, creating a strange shape in the center that looked like a shadow moving around, although there wasn't anybody standing there. I paused and leaned over the railing, trying to see if maybe someone was below me casting the shadow, but there was nobody. I shrugged it off as a trick of the light. The bulbs in the hallway are old, and they flicker sometimes. It was probably just my eyes adjusting to the darkness. I continued down and each step creaked under my feet. I heard my own breath, slow and shallow. Then, as I looked to the center again, I saw that shadow shifting. It seemed to move in small pulses like it was matching my heartbeat. I felt something tighten in my chest. I wiped the sweat off my forehead and kept going until I reached the 1st floor. I grabbed a snack from the machine and hurried back up. Over the next few days I tried not to think about it, but I couldn't shake off that feeling of being watched whenever I used the stairs. I started hearing the steps creak in a rhythmic pattern that felt like it was in sync with my pulse. It made the hairs on my arms stand up. I sometimes tried taking the old elevator, but it's one of those freight-style lifts that makes loud clanking noises and feels unsafe. I used it once and it jerked between floors. I decided the staircase was less risky, even though it felt unsettling. About a week into living there, I had another late-night craving. It was around 2 a.m. I hadn't heard any neighbors for hours, so I figured everyone was asleep. I stepped out into the hallway and walked to the staircase door. As soon as I opened it, I sensed something off. The hallway light was out. The only light came from a small bulb on the floor above me. It cast a faint glow, enough for me to see the outline of the spiral railing. My heart pounded as I stepped onto the top stair. The wood creaked under my weight. I looked down at the center. The shadow was there again, but this time it seemed larger. I tried to ignore it. I placed one foot in front of the other, holding the railing so I wouldn't slip in the dark. Each step made a louder creak than usual. My breathing got heavier. It felt like the entire staircase was vibrating along with my heartbeat. Halfway down, I glanced at the center again. The shape was shifting like it was trembling. I blinked to clear my vision, but it stayed there. My hands were clammy, and my stomach felt tense. I forced myself to keep going. When I reached the lobby, I felt relieved. I told myself maybe it was just my imagination. I got my snack and paused by the lobby entrance, looking at the flight of stairs leading back up. I considered waiting until daylight, but it was late and I didn't want to sleep on a lobby couch. I started my ascent. My shoes made a dull thud on each step. My throat felt dry. I clutched the railing again, feeling the cold metal under my fingertips. This time the shadow seemed more active. It swayed in the center, and every time I paused it looked like it was reacting to my movement. I could almost feel it pulling me toward it. My heart was pounding hard. I swallowed and tried to focus on just reaching my door. My breath came in short bursts, and sweat trickled down the side of my face. Each step made a loud groan. The echo traveled up the center of the spiral. The shadow grew darker. Here's the corrected text. I felt a tremor in my legs like they might give out, but I forced myself onward. When I got back into my loft, my shirt was soaked at the collar, and my chest felt tight. I locked the door and leaned against it, trying to calm down. It took me a few minutes to catch my breath. I kept looking through the peephole, expecting something to appear on the other side. Nothing did. Eventually, I got ready for bed and tried to sleep. I dreamt of standing on those steps, hearing the wood creak like a heartbeat. I woke up at dawn, shaken. The next day, I walked downstairs during daylight to test the stairs again. It didn't feel as bad. The place had natural light. The center looked normal. I didn't see a shadow. I told myself that I just needed to get used to the old building's quirks. Maybe I was scaring myself for no reason. I started using the stairs more often in the afternoon, going down to grab groceries, taking out the trash. It felt normal then. People passed me from time to time. They said hi and kept moving. Nothing seemed strange in the daytime, but at night, it was different. The tension in my chest returned as soon as the sun went down. Around 11:30 p.m., I'd start worrying about having to go down for anything. Sometimes I'd decide not to get a late snack just to avoid those steps, but I couldn't avoid them forever. A few days later, I had to do laundry around midnight. The laundry room is in the basement. The elevator was apparently stuck again. I had no choice. I picked up my laundry bag, took a deep breath, and opened my door. The hallway was dim. The overhead lights flickered. I stepped into the staircase area, and a dull bulb lit up the top landing. The center was dark, except for some shifting shadows. I couldn't see if anything was actually moving or if it was just the flicker of the bulb. I gripped the railing and started down. With every step, I heard that groan that matched my heartbeat. It felt like someone was pressing on my chest. My arms tingled, and I could feel each hair on my forearm stand on end. When I reached the basement level, I hurried to the laundry room. It was cold and smelled musty. The washing machines hummed. I threw my clothes in and stood there looking around. The basement hallway was quiet, just an old concrete corridor. I paced around, waiting for the cycle to finish. My breathing eventually slowed. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there was no reason to be afraid of a shadow. After all, I hadn't seen any actual figure, no footsteps behind me, no voices, just that shape in the center of the stairs. When the load was done, I moved everything to the dryer, then waited again. The hum of the machines was steady, and I almost felt calm. But every time I thought about climbing back up, my chest tightened. Eventually, I gathered my dry clothes in the bag and stood at the bottom of the staircase. I looked up. The spiral towered above me, disappearing into the darkness. The only lights were single bulbs on each floor, which made a weak glow that barely lit the stairs. I placed one foot on the bottom step. It creaked. I paused. I heard my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I gripped the railing. The metal felt colder than before, almost like ice. I took another step, then another. Each time, the sound matched the pulse in my chest. I felt dizzy. I kept going, but I moved slowly. When I reached the second floor, I glanced at the center. The shadow was bigger than I'd ever seen it. It looked like a dark shape that was fluttering. My throat felt dry, and I swallowed hard. My body tensed. Part of me wanted to run, but I was worried I might trip on the steps. So I forced myself to keep a steady pace. As I climbed to the third floor, the shadow seemed to sway more violently. I sensed a pressure in my head, like a dull ache. I reached my landing, practically gasping for air. I could feel my pulse in my neck. My skin felt clammy. I fumbled with my keys, opened my door, and slid inside. I set my clothes down and tried to calm myself. My heart was still racing. I could hear it thudding in my ears. I stepped into the bathroom, turned on the faucet, and splashed cold water on my face. My hands were shaking. I gripped the edge of the sink and looked at myself in the mirror. I looked worn out, with dark circles under my eyes. I thought about taking a sleeping pill just to knock myself out, but I decided against it, worried that I might need to stay alert. Another week passed, and the pattern repeated. Late at night, if I had to use the stairs, I saw that shadow. Every time it seemed bigger. I started feeling like it was watching me. I didn't see eyes or anything like that, but the sensation of being observed was strong. My chest felt tight each time I approached the landing. The creaking stairs felt more alive. Sometimes it felt like the steps were vibrating. I had the impression that the entire spiral was breathing with me. One night, around 3 a.m., I heard noises in the hallway. It sounded like pipes rattling. I wanted to check if there was a leak, so I opened my door and walked toward the staircase. As soon as I opened the door to the stairwell, my heart rate spiked. The entire area seemed darker than usual, even though there was a bulb on. I stepped inside and the air felt heavy. Each breath felt forced. My palms were sweaty and my arms felt numb. I looked over the railing. The center was filled with that pulsing shape, which shifted in small waves. I heard the wood creak even though I hadn't set foot on it yet. It was like the steps were moving on their own. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out. I gripped the railing and watched the shadow drift upward. It felt like it was coming closer to me. My head felt light and my legs wobbled. I backed away, my eyes locked on that dark shape. Then I slammed the door shut, retreated to my loft, and locked myself inside. I spent the rest of that night awake. I sat on my couch, knees pulled up, trying to regulate my breathing. My pulse slowly returned to normal, but I couldn't shake the cold feeling in my chest. Around 6 o'clock a.m., I finally dozed off. When I woke up, the sun was shining. The building seemed normal again. I decided I needed to check out the stairwell in the daytime, so I went out around noon. The place was bright, and the spiral looked ordinary. There was no shadow in the center, just the normal darkness of the space below. I walked all the way down to the lobby and back up, and everything seemed fine. No weird sounds, no pulsing sensation. I almost believed I had imagined everything, but late that night it happened again. I heard a dripping noise in my bathroom, and I needed to get a toolkit for my car to fix the faucet. I didn't trust the elevator, so I went to the staircase around 1:30. The second I opened the door, I heard the deep groan. My heartbeat sped up. I hesitated at the top step, looking down at the center. The shadow was there, bigger than I'd ever seen it. It seemed to fill the gap. I felt panic rising in my chest. My breathing got fast and shallow. My eyes watered, but I had to get my tools. I started down, trying not to look at the center. I kept my gaze on the steps in front of me. My foot touched each creaking plank. My hands shook on the railing. Sweat rolled down my temples. The air felt thick and it smelled stale. Every few steps I glanced at the center. The shadow seemed to ripple like it was moving in time with my own pulse. I kept going, step by step. By the time I reached the first floor, my legs were trembling. My chest felt constricted, and my shirt was damp. I could barely breathe through my nose, so I was panting through my mouth. I rushed to the building's entrance, grabbed my toolkit from the car, and then stood there, staring back at the lobby door. I felt like the staircase was calling me, urging me to return. I forced myself to push through, open that door, and walk back in. The lobby was empty and quiet. I looked up the spiral. It seemed darker at the top, even though there were lights on each level. My pulse throbbed in my throat. I swallowed and stepped onto the staircase again. The wood groaned under my weight. I felt a shiver run up my back. My chest felt like it was going to explode. I gripped the railing so hard my knuckles ached. As I climbed, the creaking got louder. I smelled dust. My stomach churned. Had the urge to stop, but I kept going, not wanting to stay in that space any longer than necessary. When I passed the second floor, the shadow flickered. I felt a wave of nausea. My heart hammered against my rib cage. My vision blurred for a second. I forced one foot forward, then the other. Finally, I reached the third floor. I stumbled onto my landing and hurried to my door. I unlocked it, slipped inside, and shut it firmly behind me. I collapsed onto my couch, toolkit still in hand. My breath came in quick, rough bursts. I felt an ache in my arms and legs. My pulse pounded in my temples. I sat there for a long time, too shaky to fix the faucet. I realized then that whatever is in the center of that spiral is getting stronger each time I see it. I don't know if it's real or if I'm losing my mind. All I know is that every time I step onto those stairs at night, I feel something pulling at me. I feel the wood under my feet vibrating like it's part of some giant heartbeat. And I can't shake the thought that one day I might go down those steps and never come back. I never expected to find a hidden window in my own home. I was in the middle of tearing down an old plaster wall in the hallway when my crowbar hit a smooth surface behind the drywall. I pulled the pieces away, thinking I might just find some forgotten wiring or a patch job from a previous renovation. Instead, I uncovered a window with a wooden frame. It was covered in dust and the glass looked cloudy. My stomach clenched at the sight because I knew there was no corresponding window on the exterior of the house. Outside there was only a flat wall, painted grey, with no structure beyond it. Yet here was this window exactly where no window should exist. I leaned in and wiped the glass with my shirt sleeve. The reflection was weak, but then I could see a faint glow on the other side. I peered through the glass thinking maybe I'd see insulation or a gap in the wall. Instead, I saw a small room. My breath caught in my chest. It looked like a bedroom. There was a narrow bed with a plain comforter, a side table with an old lamp, and a soap dresser against the far wall. The lamp was on, creating a soft circle of light that reached the edges of the bed and the dresser. I couldn't see a door or any other piece of furniture. I felt sweat gathering at the back of my neck. I poked the glass with my finger. It felt cold. I didn't understand how this was possible. I pulled away and went outside with a flashlight circling my house's exterior. The spot where that window should have been was just a continuous strip of siding. There wasn't even a bump in the structure. I came back inside and checked the blueprint I had in the drawer. It showed nothing in that area except the standard hallway layout. No mention of an extra room or any extension. I felt a low buzz in my head like my thoughts were short-circuiting. It seemed impossible, but I couldn't deny what I had seen. That night I couldn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes I saw that small room. I pictured the dim lamp casting shadows on the walls. I imagined what it would be like to stand inside that space. I wanted to knock on the glass or find some way to open it. I wanted to run my hand around the window frame to see if there was a latch. My curiosity was pushing me to explore more, but I also felt an unease. It wasn't normal to find a furnished room behind a wall where no room should exist. Early in the morning, I got up and decided to investigate again. I returned to the hallway and used a hammer to remove more of the old drywall, being careful not to shatter the window. Once I had the entire frame exposed, I ran my hands along its edges. It felt solid. There was no hinge or lock on my side, and the glass was thick. The wood looked old, as if it had been there for decades. I checked it behind the frame, trying to see if it was just a decorative piece. It wasn't. Through the glass, I still saw the lamp's glow. I felt a cold, sinking feeling in my gut. I decided to knock on the glass. My knuckles tapped the surface. The lamp flickered once and then stayed on. There was no response beyond that. Over the next few days, I tried to figure out if there was a hidden entrance to that strange room. I opened every closet and crawled into the attic to see if there was a trapdoor or a hidden corridor. I found nothing, no door, no hatch, no crawl space that led there. During the daytime, I would stare through the glass for several minutes at a time, hoping to catch a clue. The bed was neatly made. The lamp sat on a worn wooden side table. A few sheets of paper were scattered on the dresser. Everything looked slightly dusty, as if it hadn't been cleaned in a while. But the lamp never went out. I couldn't understand how the electricity worked if it wasn't connected to my known wiring. I considered drilling into the wall from the outside, but a small voice inside me told me not to. I couldn't explain why, but the thought made my stomach roll. One evening, I checked the window just before bed. The hallway was dark, so I flipped on the overhead light and leaned in close. The lamp was still on. I thought I saw something move near the dresser, but it might have been a trick of my own reflection. Still, I pressed my forehead against the glass. That was when I noticed a shape. It looked like a person standing by the foot of the bed, leaning over. I froze. My heart started pounding and I felt my arms tense up and my breathing go shallow. I strained to see more clearly. The figure was moving something around on the bed. Then it turned slowly toward the window. I jumped back. My spine tingled and the hairs on my arms stood up. My first thought was that I was seeing my reflection, but that didn't make sense because the angle was off. The figure had its head cocked to one side and it seemed to stare in my direction. I whispered, "Hello?" My voice sounded shaky. The figure didn't reply. It just stood there, as if studying me. I felt a surge of adrenaline in my chest. I wanted to run, but I forced myself to stand still and keep looking. I noticed that the figure's eyes were shiny. There was a dull reflection in them, like a mirror catching a bit of light. Something about that reflection made me feel sick. It was almost like I was looking at my own eyes, but reversed. I couldn't see the figure's face clearly. It was mostly a silhouette, with the lamp's light creating a dim outline around it. It wasn't tall or short, just average, but it felt familiar. I backed away from the window. The figure didn't move. It just stayed there, watching. The next morning I tried to convince myself that maybe I had imagined the figure. Lack of sleep and too much stress could have made me see things. During the day, the room on the other side of the window looked empty and still. The bed, the lamp and the dresser were the same. No sign of anyone. I knocked again. Silence. I moved on with my day, doing errands and trying to ignore the worry building inside me. Every so often the memory of that figure would flash in my mind and I'd feel my stomach clench. That night I put on a hoodie and decided to watch the window from a chair in the hallway. I turned off all the lights except for a small lamp at the other end, so I could see the window more clearly without too much reflection. I sat there, arms crossed, feet tapping the floor, listening to every small sound in the house. The wind outside rattled a loose gutter, and the fridge in the kitchen hummed. Everything else was quiet. After about an hour, I started feeling restless. My eyelids felt heavy. Then I saw movement in the room again. It was the same figure. It seemed to appear at the edge of the bed. The lamp in that room flickered once. I felt a jolt in my chest. My legs twitched. I gripped the arms of the chair and stood up slowly. I moved closer to the window. The figure bent over the bed, picking up scattered papers. Then it straightened and faced me directly. My pulse thudded behind my ears. It lifted one hand, almost as if to wave. I stared. My throat went dry. I raised my own hand, trembling slightly. The figure tilted its head again. My eyes focused on those reflective eyes. They seemed to show my face like I was looking into a dark mirror. Without thinking, I mouthed, "Who are you?" My breath fogged the glass for a moment. The figure pressed its palm against the air above the bed. Then it dropped the papers on the comforter. I could see the slight motion of the papers fluttering. Then the figure stepped closer. Now it was near where the dresser was, but I still couldn't see any details of its face. One that it had short hair and a shape similar to mine. My heart pounded so hard my ribs hurt. I backed away from the window, feeling a sudden surge of panic. My feet stumbled on the uneven flooring where I had removed some boards. I almost fell. When I looked back, the figure was still there, standing by the bed with a rigid posture. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched by something unnatural. I hurried to my bedroom, shut the door and locked it. My heart was racing. My hands were clammy. I could barely form a coherent thought. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured those eyes staring straight into me. For several days, I avoided the hallway. I tried to pretend that the window wasn't there. I focused on other parts of the renovation. I painted the living room walls and replaced an old light fixture in the dining room. But every time I walked past the hallway, a chill ran through me. My mind kept drifting back to that strange scene. The room, the lamp, the figure, and those reflective eyes. One evening I got the courage to check again. I turned on the hallway light and stood in front of the window. The room on the other side looked the same. The lamp glowed softly, the bed was unwrinkled, and the papers on the dresser were a bit scattered. But I didn't see the figure at first. I braced my hands on the windowsill and leaned in, hoping for some kind of normal explanation. Then the lamp flickered. I felt a spike of anxiety in my chest. I waited, my breath stuck in my throat. The silhouette appeared again, this time standing near the dresser. I saw one of its hands reach out and slide the papers around as if searching for something. I decided to speak again, even though it hadn't answered before. I forced my voice to stay steady. "I don't know what you want. I don't know how you got in there." My jaw clenched and I felt my arms shaking. The figure didn't respond. It just kept fiddling with those papers. Then it turned its head in my direction. Its eyes locked on me. I felt my heartbeat slam against my ribs. My mouth went dry. My lips parted, but I couldn't say anything else. Suddenly the figure bent forward, picked up one paper, and held it out in front of its face. It was as though it wanted me to see something, but from my angle, I couldn't read whatever was on that sheet. My eyes darted across the surface of the glass, looking for any detail. The figure then folded the paper and slipped it into the bed's pillowcase. My scalp tingled. I couldn't explain why, but it felt significant, like I was missing a clue. My mind raced. Then the lamp flickered again. In that brief darkness, the figure vanished. The lamp came back on, and the room was empty. I stood there, panting, my palms pressed against the wall. The air around me felt cold and thick. I realized I was covered in sweat. I could feel the dampness under my arms. My breathing was rough and unsteady. My heart was pounding so hard that I could hear my own pulse. I wondered if I should call someone. But who would I call? An electrician? A paranormal investigator? I felt ridiculous even thinking about it. There was no logical explanation, and I hated feeling helpless. Over the next few nights, I tried to ignore the window again, but my curiosity kept gnawing at me. I couldn't focus on anything else. I wanted to find out if there was a way to reach that room. I started tapping on walls and floors more carefully, searching for hollow spots. I measured the external dimensions of the house. Then, I measured the internal ones. There was a clear mismatch. There was about a 7-foot section unaccounted for on the inside. But outside, it didn't exist. The math didn't add up at all. My frustration grew, and my hands shook every time I held the tape measure. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, but everything around me was too real. One night I decided to keep watch again, but this time with a camera. I propped my phone on a stool in the hallway, aimed it at the window, and hit record. I sat next to it, arms folded, waiting in silence. The house was quiet. My mind wandered to normal things like how many hours of work I'd missed that week, and whether I should see a therapist about my growing anxiety. Then the lamp flickered in that mysterious room. My chest tightened. I leaned forward, eyes locked on the glass. The silhouette appeared, standing near the foot of the bed, sorting through the same papers. I heard my own breathing speed up. My phone was recording everything, so I held back from speaking. I wanted to review the footage and confirm I wasn't hallucinating. The figure turned toward me slowly. I felt a jolt of fear, and I squeezed my fists. My nails dug into my palms. I refused to look away. The figure walked closer to the window, though it never reached it. It stopped a few feet away. I could see that weird reflection in its eyes again. It was like looking into a cloudy mirror. I felt an urgent need to turn off the camera and run, but I forced myself to stay. Then, in a soft blink of the lamp, the figure was gone. My heart rate stayed high for a long time. Once I felt steady enough, I grabbed my phone and reviewed the recording. My hands trembled, and the phone shook. The hallway looked normal, just me sitting there with a tense expression. Then the lamp in the other room flickered on camera. For a second, I saw a dark shape in the reflection of the glass. It was faint, just a shadow. Then the lamp steadied, and the shadow faded. It didn't look like what I had actually seen. The phone didn't capture the figure's details. It looked more like a glitch or a light distortion. My skin prickled with frustration. It felt like I had no proof. I considered smashing the window. I thought about taking a sledgehammer and breaking through the glass just to see what would happen, but I had a gut feeling that would lead to something worse. I couldn't explain it. It was just a deep instinct that told me to stop. Maybe I was afraid of disturbing whatever was in there. Maybe I was just afraid of what I'd find if I broke through. The idea made my hands sweat. Over the last week, I've tried to carry on with normal life as much as I can. I still see that silhouette at least every other night. Sometimes it's rummaging through papers. Sometimes it stands near the dresser, as if listening. Once in a while it moves to the side of the bed and just stays there, facing the window. Every single time it notices me, it makes that slight tilt of the head, and I feel my heart clench. Its eyes always seem to shine back at me, like they share the same shape and color as mine. I can prove that, but my intuition says it's so. I've had trouble sleeping. My dreams are always filled with that dimly lit room. I wake up with my clothes damp from sweat. I move through my days feeling drained, but I can't let go. I keep checking the hallway, sometimes even in the early morning, hoping the window will just be normal or empty, but it remains the same, like a portal to a place that shouldn't exist. Last night I tried leaving a note taped to the glass. It said, "Who are you?" in bold letters. I left it there with a piece of clear tape on the corners. A few hours later, I checked and found the note on the floor of the hallway, as if it had fallen off. The tape was intact, but it was curled. I don't know if that means anything or if it was just the tape losing its grip, but it still unnerved me. Or I'm running out of logical steps. I've researched old records of the house and found nothing unusual. The property was built 40 years ago, and the records show only standard renovations, nothing about sealed-off rooms or hidden spaces. I feel stuck. Every time I try to think rationally, I come up against this impossible reality. There is a window in my hallway that looks into a furnished room with a functioning lamp, and there's a figure inside that room, and I can reach that room from any doorway or passage in the house. Sometimes I wonder if I should just sell the place and leave, but that feels like running from a puzzle that's meant for me. I'm not sure what would happen if someone else found this window. Would they see the same figure? Would it just disappear once I was gone? These questions keep me up at night. For now, I go through the motions of my renovation, avoiding the hallway whenever I can. But the window is always there. I can feel its presence when I walk by. The hairs on my arms stand up and I get goosebumps. In some moments I think about breaking it open and stepping through, but I never do it. I don't know if I'm more afraid of what's in there or what it might mean for me if I cross that threshold. Right now, I'm just trying to hold on to what's left of my calm. But I can't deny this. Every time I glance through that glass and see those eyes looking back, I feel a chill that shakes me to the core. I feel like I'm staring into a part of myself that I can't recognize, and it terrifies me in a way I've never experienced before. I noticed the figure around midnight standing in the top floor window, completely still and facing me. I had just finished a long day of meetings and wanted nothing more than to sleep. My room was on the 4th floor of this old neoclassical hotel, which sat in a quiet part of downtown. The hotel's exterior looked worn, with chipped columns and a heavy wooden door that opened onto the street. Inside, the lobby had faded wallpaper, squeaky floors, and a lingering scent of old furniture. My room smelled like stale carpet and cleaning chemicals. I tossed my suitcase beside the bed, turned on the small lamp by the window, and tried to ignore the feeling that something was off. The first time I saw the figure, I assumed it was a trick of the light. I was leaning against my window, looking at the buildings across the street. Then I shifted my gaze to the top floor of this place. The figure looked like a person standing perfectly still with eyes locked on me. It didn't move, wave, or do anything else, just stood there. My heart thumped, and I felt a tightness in my chest. I wondered if I was imagining things. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. The figure was still there. About 10 minutes later, I went down to the reception desk. I wanted to find out who else might be staying on that top floor. The lobby was mostly empty except for a single desk, clerk, and a wrinkled shirt. He had a bored expression. I asked him about the top floor. He gave me a puzzled look. The top floor is closed for renovations, he said. It's been sealed off for months due to safety issues. He told me no one was allowed up there, and the management kept it locked at all times. I explained that I saw someone in the window. He shrugged, looking unconvinced. It's probably your imagination or a reflection from outside, he said. Then he turned back to his computer screen and left me standing there. I went back to my room feeling uneasy. My mind kept replaying the sight of that still figure. I tried to brush my teeth and wash my face, hoping the hot water would calm my nerves. My hands felt shaky. My mouth felt dry. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that silent silhouette staring at me from above. I couldn't relax. I lay down on the bed, switching off the lamp. The darkness made me feel more tense. The sheets felt rough against my skin and the pillow smelled like old fabric softener. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. After about an hour of tossing and turning, I got up. I opened the curtains and looked across the street. Traffic was minimal, with just a few cars rolling by. I angled myself to see that top floor window again. The figure was gone. I exhaled in relief, then felt a surge of confusion. Where had it gone? If that part of the hotel was sealed, what was I actually seeing? I told myself to forget it. Maybe it was nothing. But a nagging curiosity took over. I wanted to check that floor. I slipped on my shoes and grabbed my key. I left my room and walked towards the stairwell. The hallway was quiet, with yellow lighting that flickered at the end. The steps creaked when I pushed open the heavy door. The stairwell smelled of dust and old paint. I climbed one floor, then another. I passed the 5th floor, where the carpets were partially removed, revealing cracked tiles underneath. The walls up here had peeling paint. It was obvious this part of the building hadn't been refurbished for a long time. Eventually I reached a locked metal gate, blocking the way to the next flight of stairs. A sign hung there, warning guests to keep out. I gripped the bars, trying to peer through the darkness on the other side. I couldn't see much. A single overhead light flickered, revealing a long corridor with closed doors. I pressed my ear to the bars, listening for any sound. At first, there was nothing. Then I heard the faint echo of footsteps. They sounded deliberate, as if someone was pacing. The hair on my arm stood on end. My breath caught in my throat. I thought about calling out, but I held back. I felt a surge of adrenaline and pulled at the metal gate, but it refused to budge. It was secured with a chain and a padlock. I stared into the corridor again. Every few seconds the light above flickered, and I thought I saw movement at the far end. I felt my pulse throbbing in my neck. The cold sweat gathered on my forehead. My thoughts raced. Who was up there? Why would the desk clerk say it was sealed off if someone was clearly walking around? I decided to head back down to the front desk to ask more questions. My footfalls echoed in the stairwell, and my breathing sounded loud in the enclosed space.
When I reached the lobby, the same clerk was gone. A different guy was there, older, with glasses sliding down his nose.
I asked him again about the top floor. He repeated the same story. Renovations, off limits, no one was there. I insisted that I heard footsteps. He shrugged and looked tired. He said the staff had to keep that floor empty, and if I was hearing anything, maybe it was old pipes or air in the vents. I realized I wasn't getting anywhere with him. He handed me a business card for the hotel manager, saying I could call in the morning. It was close to 2 a.m. by then, so I left it alone and returned to my room. I tried to sleep again, but my mind wouldn't settle. I scrolled through my phone, watched the news on low volume, and even considered stepping outside for fresh air. But I didn't want to leave the building. Part of me felt drawn to figuring out what was happening on that top floor. Around 3 a.m. I heard a faint tapping on the wall behind my bed. It was gentle and rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. Then it stopped for a while and started again. I pressed my ear to the wall. Nothing. I began to wonder if I was hearing things, but I felt certain I wasn't imagining it. The walls in this place were old and not well insulated, so I knew it could be something from the plumbing, but I couldn't calm down. I got out of bed, opened my window, and craned my neck to look upward. The top floor window was now dark. I couldn't see anyone. I leaned out a bit more, feeling the cool night air on my face. Then, a light flickered up there just for a second. My stomach tightened. I thought I saw that silhouette again. It moved out of sight instantly. My hands gripped the windowsill tightly. My eyes strained to see better. The light was gone as quickly as it came. I decided to try another approach. I left my room with my phone's flashlight and walked down the hallway, glancing at each door. Most rooms were silent, while some had a soft hum of TV. I found a second stairwell near the end of the corridor, behind a door marked staff only. The door was unlocked. Inside, the stairwell smelled musty, with cobwebs in the corners. It felt colder here, as if no one bothered to heat this area. I aimed my phone's flashlight up the steps. The walls were lined with old pipes and cracked plaster. I climbed slowly, being careful with each step. The stairs were steep and narrow. About 2 flights up, I reached another locked gate. This one looked older, with a rusted chain. I paused, holding my breath. I could hear a soft scraping noise, like footsteps on a rough surface, coming from above me. My heart pounded against my rib cage. My mouth went dry. I tried to shine the light through the gaps, but I couldn't see anything beyond a few feet of corridor. The scraping stopped. Everything went quiet again. I heard my own breath, shallow and quick. I debated calling out, but decided to stay silent. If there was a trespasser, or some staff member ignoring regulations, I didn't want to startle them. I also didn't want them to know I was there. I tested the chain on the gate, pulling gently. It rattled. I hesitated for a moment, then gave it a harder tug. The chain didn't break, but it shifted enough for me to notice that the door behind it had some give. The gate itself was locked to the stair rail, so there was no obvious way through. My palms were sweating, and I wiped them on my pants. I felt a sudden wave of anxiety. The entire building seemed too quiet, as though it was holding its breath. My phone battery was running low. The flashlight dimmed a bit, which added to my tension. I remembered the figure's face, or lack of expression. It had been so still, staring at me. I started imagining that face around every corner. I forced myself to take slow breaths, counting each one. I backtracked to my room again, thinking I would at least wait until morning to speak with the manager in person. When I got back inside, I locked my door. I stood there in the dark for a moment, catching my breath. My eyes darted to the window. It was still open. I closed it, turned the lock, and shut the curtains. I wanted no more surprises from that top floor window. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my phone. My battery was at 50. I plugged it into the charger on the bedside table. I felt the weight of fatigue pulling at me. My legs were tired from climbing all those stairs. Around 4 a.m., I heard a thump in the hallway. It wasn't loud, but it sounded forceful, like someone slamming a door. I jumped up, my heart racing. I opened my door a crack and peeked outside. The corridor was dimly lit. I saw no one. I stepped out carefully, leaving my door ajar. I listened for a moment. It was silent. I took a few steps towards the staircase I had used earlier. The door was still shut. I tried the handle. It was locked now, and the sign said, "Staff only. Authorized personnel." I felt a surge of frustration. Someone must have locked it while I was in my room. I decided to check the main staircase again. I walked over there, my footsteps echoing on the worn carpet. At the center of the floor, an old brass chandelier hung from the ceiling, giving off a weak yellow glow. I reached the staircase door and opened it. I looked up. The overhead lights were flickering. A draft of cold air brushed past me. I shone my phone's flashlight upwards. The gate on the next floor was still there, locked in place. No movement, no sounds. I thought about the footsteps I'd heard earlier. My imagination conjured the possibility that someone could be on the other side, hiding in the shadows. My stomach tightened with a mix of fear and curiosity. I wanted to push forward, but I also felt an urge to retreat to my room. My rational mind told me to go back, wait until morning, and get the manager or someone from maintenance to unlock that floor. My instincts told me there was something wrong about this place, and maybe I should just find another hotel. But I had obligations here. I was stuck for at least another day. I checked my watch. It was almost 4:30. I decided to give up for the night. I was exhausted, running on adrenaline. My muscles felt tight and my eyelids were heavy. I returned to my room once more, locked the door, and left the lights on. I lay down, pulling the covers over me. My heart rate was still high, and I found it hard to slow my thoughts. I stared at the ceiling, focusing on the cracks in the paint. My ears were tuned to every small sound. Occasionally, I heard the elevator ding on a different floor or muffled voices from other guests. After a long stretch of silence, I finally drifted off to sleep. When I woke up, it was almost 9 a.m. My body felt stiff, and my mind felt cloudy. I swung my feet out of bed and stretched. I could still feel a bit of tension in my shoulders. I took a quick shower, letting the hot water run over my face. Then I got dressed and went down to the lobby with the manager's card in my pocket. The lobby was busier, with a few guests checking out. The morning staff at the front desk was different from the night shift. A woman greeted me, smiling politely. I asked to speak to the manager. She said he was in the office behind the reception desk and offered to let him know I was waiting. I stood near a sofa, tapping my foot on the marble floor. My thoughts were still jumbled from the night. I wondered if, in the daylight, I might see that top floor window more clearly. After a few minutes, a man in a suit approached me, introducing himself as the manager. He asked how he could help. I told him about the figure in the window, the footsteps, and my attempts to reach that floor. He maintained a professional composure, thanked me for letting him know, and said he'd investigate. He repeated that the top floor was shut down, and assured me no guest had access. He also said he'd look into any possible break-ins or unauthorized personnel. I didn't detect any alarm in his voice, just a measured response. I wanted to push for more details, but something in his demeanor told me I wouldn't get much else then. I stepped out of the hotel to grab breakfast at a nearby cafe. On my way out, I looked up at the top floor windows. They were dark with dusty panes. I saw no sign of movement. The morning light made the building look less menacing, but I still remembered how it felt hours earlier. My body still reacted with tension in my chest and a slight tremble in my hands. That day, I had a series of business meetings downtown. I tried to stay focused, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that sealed floor and the figure in the window. My phone was filled with random web searches about old hotels in the area, but I didn't find anything about this particular building that explained my experience. By the late afternoon, I felt worn out. I decided I'd confront the manager again if I heard anything else that night. I still don't know exactly what I saw up there. I keep replaying the moment I locked eyes with that figure. The memory of those echoing footsteps is lodged in my mind. I didn't see any children, and I didn't hear of anyone dying. but something about that top floor felt wrong. Maybe it was just an illusion, or maybe someone snuck in, but the staff's indifference didn't sit well with me. Even now, when I think about that window, I feel a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I can still picture the shape of that person standing motionless, watching. Nothing else has made me doubt my own senses the way that night did. Even if I never get an explanation, I can't forget the feeling of being observed from a place that was supposed to be empty. I never expected to feel unnerved by an empty living room. When I moved into my new apartment, I had a big open space with smooth wooden floors and white walls. It was a corner unit with large windows looking out onto a city street. The rest of my apartment had some basic furnishings: a bed, a small dining table, a few chairs and a desk for my computer. But the living room stayed empty. I told myself I would save money first, and then buy a sofa, a coffee table, maybe a bookshelf. Until then, I was content with the echo that bounced off those bare walls when I walked across the floor. The first night I heard something strange was a Tuesday. I'd been in the apartment for about 2 weeks by then. Around 9 at night, I was sitting at my dining table, finishing up some work on my laptop. The living room was a few steps away, with the doorway wide open. My eyes drifted there every so often because I liked the sense of space. Then I heard a long scraping sound like a chair dragging on a hard surface. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. My heart thumped. I set my laptop aside and walked toward the living room, thinking it must be someone in the apartment above me. But when I reached the threshold, I heard nothing. I stood there, staring into the empty room. There was a small overhead light, so I flicked the switch. The room looked exactly the way I'd left it. Bare floor, no furniture, no objects, no sign that anything had been moved. I turned off the light and went back to my dining table, feeling a little uneasy but assuming it was just normal building noise. Over the next few days I heard more of those sounds, usually at night. Sometimes it was a short screech, like a table leg scraping across wood. Other times it was a dull thud, like something heavy being bumped against a wall. I tried to ignore it. I turned on the TV to drown it out. I reasoned that old buildings made weird noises. Maybe neighbors had some furniture they kept rearranging. But I noticed the sounds seemed to come from my living room specifically. They didn't come from above or below, and they seemed to echo in that open space. One Saturday evening, I decided to test something. I sat in the living room with the lights off, my back against the wall, and just listened. At first, there was nothing. It was quiet for about 10 minutes. Then I heard a faint scrape near the far corner. I turned my head, aiming my ear in that direction. The scrape happened again, as if someone was sliding a small table across the floor. I stood up, trying to locate the noise. The moment I got on my feet, it stopped. My palms felt sweaty. My throat felt dry. I flipped on the light. The room was empty. I placed my hand on the floor where I thought the noise had come from, but it was smooth and undisturbed, no scratches or marks. I felt my chest tighten. Something about the silence in that moment made my skin prickle. I stayed awake late that night. I lay in bed, listening for sounds. I heard a few dull thuds around midnight, but nothing else. I fell asleep telling myself it was just my imagination, maybe amplified by the bare acoustics of that large room. A few days later, the sounds escalated. They weren't just faint scrapes anymore. I heard what sounded like furniture being pushed from one wall to the other. Long dragging noises moved across the floor. Sometimes they went on for a minute at a time. I'd rush in, turn on the light, and find nothing. The air felt cold. My ears rang. I could feel my heartbeat in my temples. I started to get tense whenever evening rolled around. I found myself avoiding the living room. I kept the door closed whenever possible, which meant I rarely saw that open space at night. I told a friend about the noises. He laughed and said, maybe I had a ghost. I wasn't in the mood to joke about it, though. He suggested I record the sounds to prove they were real. That night, I placed my phone on the living room floor, set a voice recording app to run, then left the apartment to grab dinner. When I came back, I found the phone face down, but nothing else in the room looked disturbed. I checked the recording. It was nearly an hour long. Most of it was static, like faint hissing. Around the 20-minute mark, there was a weird, low buzz. After that, I heard some clicks and pops. Then, near the 40-minute mark, there were distorted noises, almost like whispered words, but I couldn't make them out. It freaked me out more than if I'd heard clear furniture sounds because it felt personal somehow. I stored the recording on my computer and decided to try a different approach. Over the next few days, I made sure to keep track of the times. Around 8 p.m., I often heard a single scraping noise. Around 10 p.m., it happened in short bursts. Sometimes around midnight, it sounded like a full rearrangement of heavy pieces, with dragging that made the walls vibrate. It was so strong that I sometimes felt the floor under my feet quiver. I tried to speak to the building manager. He came up, stood in the living room for a few minutes, then shrugged and told me to call him if I heard it again. Of course, during the time he was there, everything stayed silent. One particular night, I decided I was going to stand inside the living room for as long as it took to hear the noises while I was physically present. I turned off all the other lights in the apartment except for the living room fixture, which was a simple overhead lamp. I stood in the center of the floor. My shoulders felt tense. My breath came out in short bursts. I waited. The clock on my phone showed 9:07. Nothing happened for 10 minutes. Then, around 9:30, I heard a scraping noise close to the wall behind me. I turned fast, nearly losing my balance. I saw only the white paint. I faced that wall, stepping closer, almost expecting to see a table or shelf appear out of thin air. But the wall was empty, and so was the floor. Then I heard a muffled thud near the opposite wall. I spun around, my heart pounding. The overhead light flickered for a split second. I felt a rush of adrenaline as if my body was preparing for danger. But all I saw was that hollow space. The sounds continued sporadically, shifting from one side of the room to the other. I could feel the vibrations through my shoes. I started to sweat, even though the night was cool. After several minutes of this, I just couldn't handle it. I backed out of the room, closed the door, and leaned against it. My forehead was damp. My stomach was twisted in knots. I tried playing music in my bedroom to calm down. The noise from the living room became even louder, almost as if it were responding to my attempt to block it out. The dragging got deeper, like heavier objects were being moved. I heard a few distant knocks on the wall. I walked back into the hallway and knocked on the living room door, feeling silly for doing so. The noises paused. That made me feel a little braver, so I opened the door. Silence. I stood there breathing hard, and then I felt a faint tremor under my feet again, like something was scraping across the floor behind me. I snapped the door shut and rushed to my bedroom, locking it. I lay in bed wide awake, pulse racing, until exhaustion finally knocked me out around 3 a.m. The next day I tried to recreate the sounds by dragging a chair across my kitchen floor. The pitch and tone seemed close. I also tried moving a small cabinet to see if that matched the heavier vibrations. It sounded somewhat similar, but not exact. My brain told me that the noises in the living room were more forceful and resonant, almost as if there were multiple pieces of furniture being dragged at once. But I had to rely on memory, because my recordings only captured static and weird whispers. One day I asked a neighbor across the hall if she had heard any strange sounds lately. She shook her head and said she never heard anything, though she did comment that my unit was larger than most. She asked if I was enjoying the extra space. I said yes, but didn't mention the problem. I didn't want to sound like I was losing it. However, her response made me wonder if the walls were thick enough that other tenants couldn't hear what I was experiencing. A few nights after that, I decided to leave the living room door open and keep the lights on in both the hallway and living room. I stood at the threshold, watching, waiting. Around 10 p.m., I felt a slight tremor in the floor. My eyes darted to the corner. Nothing was there. Another tremor rippled under my feet. I felt my calf muscles tense. A scraping sound shot through the air. It was loud, like a heavy wooden table leg dragging across the floor. The overhead light didn't flicker, but it felt dimmer somehow. My breathing got shallow. I stepped into the room. The noise stopped again, leaving only a faint hum in my ears. My arms felt clammy. My head pounded. Then a knock echoed against the wall right next to me.
Shindy, I nearly jumped out of my skin.
When I pressed my hand to the spot, it felt cold. I tried to push against the wall, but it was solid. I tapped back. No response. My heart hammered in my chest. Over the next hour, I made 5 or 6 trips into that room. Each time the noises paused or faded when I entered. When I left, they started up again. Sometimes I'd be halfway down the hallway and I'd hear a scraping noise behind me. I'd whip around, see nothing but that open doorway, and feel goosebumps along my arms. It became a game of cat and mouse, except I never saw the cat or the mouse. I only heard them. It reached a peak one Sunday night. I was trying to watch TV in my bedroom. It was around 11 o'clock p.m. The noises in the living room were so loud that I couldn't focus on the show. I heard deep thuds, sliding sounds, and occasional taps on the walls. It felt like a full rearrangement was happening in there, as if someone was hauling chairs and tables across the room and then pushing them against the walls. I could feel the vibrations in my bed. My stomach churned. I considered leaving the apartment to clear my head, but I worried that something else might happen while I was gone. I wanted to witness it if it escalated. So I got up, marched to the living room door, and opened it wide. The sound died on the spot. I stepped inside with my phone's flashlight on, even though the overhead light was also on. I scanned every corner, checking the walls, the floor, and the windows. The windows were shut tight, the floor was bare, and the walls had no density. My arms felt weak. My mouth went dry. I yelled, "Who's here?" My voice echoed in the emptiness. I tried to record with my phone's video function this time. I started filming the center of the living room, capturing the entire space. For a few moments it was just me breathing hard. Then a scraping sound came from behind the camera. I spun around filming the wall. The video feed showed only emptiness. My heart pounded. I kept filming, pivoting in a slow circle, hoping to catch any movement. Another thud came from the far corner, but again, there was nothing visible. After about 5 minutes, I stopped. When I checked the playback, the video was weirdly distorted. It was filled with static lines and glitchy frames. The audio had faint bursts of crackling noise and something that resembled breathy murmurs. I felt my stomach tighten. The phone battery dropped from 80% to 15% during those 5 minutes. That had never happened before. By that point, I was certain I was dealing with something unexplainable. I didn't have an immediate plan, but I knew I couldn't keep living like that. The tension in my body was constant. I was having trouble sleeping. I double-checked the floors for any hidden compartments or something that could cause mechanical noises. I found nothing. I tapped the walls in every spot, but they were solid. The building manager said the unit below me was vacant, so that ruled out new neighbors messing around. I felt trapped. I worried that if I brought someone in to investigate, I'd get the same result. The room would stay silent in their presence or they'd label me paranoid. The day after that Sunday, I tried to spend more time out of the apartment. I worked at coffee shops, went for walks, and hung out at a friend's place. But every time I came home, I sensed that thick atmosphere in my living room. The scraping sounds picked up as soon as night fell. I felt worn down. My nerves were shot, and I snapped at people for no reason. I was distracted at work, and I started thinking about putting the apartment back on the market even though I had just moved in and spent a lot of money. On the last night before I decided to start looking for a way out, I stood in the hallway again facing that open living room door. The overhead light flickered once but stayed on. I heard a single dragging sound, long and deliberate, move from the left wall to the right wall. My spine tingled, my hands shook, and I took a step back, then stepped forward. The sound ceased, and I realized I was gritting my teeth so hard that my jaw hurt. I closed the door, locked it, and marched to my bedroom. I locked myself in and turned on every light. I sat on my bed, feeling my heart pound, staring at the glow under the door. I waited, listening. A faint scraping noise came through the walls. I put on headphones, cranked up some music, and tried to block it out. That was my breaking point. The next morning, I contacted a realtor. I didn't care about losing money. I just wanted to get out of that apartment and away from that living room. I haven't explained much to anyone about why I wanted to leave so soon after moving in, but if anyone ever looks at me and sees the stress on my face, I usually say I had issues with the place. I don't bring up the furniture that never showed itself, or the dragging, knocking, and impossible recordings. I tell them it just wasn't a good fit. But the truth is that I'll never forget how that room felt and how those vibrations seemed to travel right into my bones. I can hear those scraping sounds, and I don't want to be anywhere near them again. So that's it. That's how it went down. And that's why I'll never leave a big room empty ever again. I arrived at the old house on a late afternoon. The sky was gray, and the air felt thick with a damp, stale smell. My instructions were clear. Catalog every piece of old watch and clock gear I could find. The front door creaked when I pushed it open. I set my suitcase on a small wooden table in the hallway and let out a long breath. I was told this house belonged to a distant relative of a collector who had passed away years ago. The place had stayed locked up for a long time. I switched on the hallway light, but the bulb was weak and flickered in an uneven rhythm. I noticed the walls were lined with antique paintings, all covered in a thin layer of dust. I walked around to get a sense of the layout. The corridor led to a living room with heavy drapes, old rug, and a grandfather clock against the wall. That clock was silent and stuck at 4. I walked closer and saw the hour hand and minute hand both fixed. The pendulum inside was still. I tapped the glass gently, but nothing moved. I shrugged and took the staircase to the second floor. The steps groaned under my weight. There was a slight chill in the air, and I felt goosebumps on my arms. At the top of the stairs there was a narrow corridor with 3 doors. One led to a bedroom that smelled of mothballs. Another door opened to a bathroom with a cracked mirror. The third door, which was at the far end, led to the attic. I pulled it open, revealing a set of wooden steps going up. A damp, dusty odor drifted down, and I felt a small breeze. My flashlight illuminated cobwebs around the corners. When I reached the attic, I saw rows of cardboard boxes stacked on tables, some wooden crates in the corners, and a single naked bulb hanging from the ceiling. I pulled the cord to turn on the light. The bulb flickered and then stayed on with a weak orange glow. The first thing I noticed was a row of clocks arranged on a shelf that ran the entire length of the attic. They ranged from tiny pocket watches to large mantel clocks with decorative faces. I stepped closer, squinting to see them in the dim light. There must have been at least 20 or 30 clocks. Every single one showed the same time. I felt something tighten in my chest. There was no reason for all these clocks to be set to the exact same time. Some had no glass over their faces. Others looked rusted and missing hands, but each visible hand was stuck at that precise hour. I picked up a small travel clock with a handle. The metal was cold. The second hand was broken off, but the hour and minute hands were locked in place. I tried turning the knob to move the hands, but they wouldn't budge. I found a slightly larger clock with a winding mechanism on the back. I tried to wind it, and I felt resistance, but nothing changed on the face. It stayed. I started to list them. In my notebook, I wrote down the types, the approximate era, any markings or brand names, and the condition. After about an hour, I had gone through 15 clocks. My back ached, and I wanted to take a break. I put the notebook aside and lifted one of the mantel clocks off a shelf. It had a glass panel that I could open from the front to adjust the hands. I pulled it open, reached in, and turned the hands with my fingertips. At first, they seemed to move. I managed to push the minute hand to 4:17, but then it resisted. My fingers slipped, and the hand spun backward with a sudden snap, returning right to I nearly dropped the clock because the force startled me. I felt my heart thump, and my palms were damp with sweat. I placed the clock back on the shelf and took a few steps away. The attic felt colder. A gust of wind rattled the small window at the far end. I could hear leaves rustling outside, brushing against the roof. The air was stale, and I noticed a faint smell of old wood and mildew. I told myself it was just a mechanical quirk. Maybe these clocks were all broken in the same position by chance. I flipped the light switch off and headed downstairs, carefully shutting the attic door behind me. I went to the living room, set up at the old desk, and began updating my notes. I had a small lamp that gave better light than the weak bulbs overhead. My watch read 7:50. My stomach growled, and I rummaged through my bag for a sandwich and some water. The living room was silent except for the occasional creak of the house. I kept glancing at the grandfather clock. It looked large and imposing. I decided I should examine it. I got up, took a closer look, and opened its glass door. Inside, the pendulum was tarnished. The winding key rested inside the case. I tried winding it. The gears clicked, but the minute hand stayed at I tested the hour hand, but it wouldn't budge. I let out a sigh and closed the door. After a quick meal, I felt tired from the drive and the attic work. I found my bedroom on the second floor, unpacked a few things, and set my alarm for 6 a.m. The bed was firm, the sheets smelled a little stale, and the pillows were flat. I closed my eyes thinking about the day's discoveries. I drifted off in a restless sleep. At some point in the night, I woke to a sharp ringing sound. It echoed through the hallway. At first I thought it was my alarm, but it was too loud and continuous. Then it stopped. I sat up, breathing hard, heart racing. The room was dark, and I saw the faint outline of the door. Another ring started, but this time it sounded like multiple chimes at once, layered over each other. I swung my legs out of bed, grabbed my phone for its light, and walked toward the hallway. The house was quiet again. My footsteps on the wooden floor were the only sounds. I crept to the top of the stairs and looked down. Dim moonlight came through the front windows. The living room looked shadowy. Suddenly several clocks chimed together. I recognized the tone of a grandfather clock, plus a mix of smaller bells. The entire house resonated with overlapping rings. It lasted around 5 seconds and then it cut off. My chest felt tight, and I could barely breathe. I wiped sweat from my forehead. My mouth was dry. I told myself, this shouldn't be happening. They're not wound, and they're all broken. I hurried downstairs, fumbling for the lights in the hallway. The switch clicked, and the light flickered on. In the living room, I saw the grandfather clock face. Still read. I put my ear to its side. It was silent. No ticking, no mechanical noise. Then I noticed several small clocks on the mantel above the fireplace. I remembered seeing them in the attic, but now they were here. My stomach dropped. I didn't recall bringing them downstairs. They sat in a neat row, and each face showed. I felt a chill run down my neck. I backed away. I went into the hallway again to make sure I wasn't imagining this. I smelled something musty, like stale air that had been trapped in a basement. I had a strong urge to leave the house, but I was under contract to finish my job, and I told myself there had to be a rational explanation. I checked my phone for the time. It was 3:11 a.m. I decided to go back to bed and wait for daylight. I returned to my room, locked the door, and paced around. Every step on the wooden floor was a reminder of how empty and still this house was. My body felt tense, my arms were stiff, and my breath felt shallow. After a while, I lay down again, my mind swirling with thoughts about the clocks, the chimes, and the strange relocation of some pieces. In the morning, I woke up exhausted. I wasn't even sure I had slept. I grabbed a quick bite from my backpack and went straight to the attic. The door was still closed, so I opened it, climbed the steps, and flipped on the light. I saw more empty spots on the shelves. Some clocks were gone, presumably the ones I had seen downstairs. My notebook was where I left it, and the crates were untouched. I moved to one of the crates and started opening it. Inside I found more watch parts, spare gears, and a few incomplete clock faces. I set them aside, made notes, and tried to focus on my work. But I kept glancing at the shelves. The clocks that remained still pointed to 4. I took a larger clock from a box on the floor. An old wooden wall clock with a glass cover. It smelled like dust and old varnish. I placed it on a small table. I found the winding hole on the front, inserted a key from a set I had in my tool bag, and tried to wind it. The gears turned inside, and I heard them click as the tension built. I saw the second hand start to move very slowly, creeping past. I felt a spark of relief. Then the second hand stopped, and the minute hand snapped back to. My eyes widened, and a cold wave ran through my arms and chest. My scalp felt prickly. I took a step back, rubbed my face, and tried to steady my breathing. I spent most of the morning cataloging the rest of the crates. After lunch, I forced myself to try adjusting the clocks again. Each time I tried, the hands either wouldn't move or would snap back to. I began to sweat, wiping my hands on my jeans. I was afraid to look away from them, as if they might shift when I wasn't looking, but they never changed. They just stayed at. That evening, I decided to stay downstairs and keep watch in the living room. I set up a small folding chair by the fireplace. I turned off the main lights, leaving only a lamp near me. The house was silent except for the faint ticking noise, which I assumed was coming from some hidden clock. I couldn't pinpoint the source. The sound was irregular, more like scraping or tapping than a steady tick. My nerves were on edge and my legs felt restless. Around 9 o'clock, I heard the first ring. A single clang, like someone hitting a piece of metal with a hammer. I jumped from the chair, my heart pounding. Then came a series of chimes, all overlapping, echoing off the walls. I held my breath, my chest tightened, and my fingers trembled. The chimes were slow and heavy, as if they were trapped in water. Then they cut off abruptly, leaving the house in total silence. I turned on every light I could find, then walked from room to room. I saw a small clock on the kitchen counter that hadn't been there before. Same time on its face. I saw another inside a glass cabinet in the dining room. Same time. My throat was dry. I thought about leaving right then, but I convinced myself I would feel better in the morning. I told myself there was an explanation, though I couldn't figure it out. Maybe I was dealing with old mechanical systems that were set up to ring at random intervals. But how were they moving around the house? I couldn't sleep, so I stayed up until midnight, watching the stairs and listening for any sounds. My eyes kept darting to the grandfather clock. It never moved from 4. I felt my eyelids grow heavy. I finally decided to go upstairs. At the base of the staircase, I paused. I heard a soft scratching noise like metal on wood coming from somewhere above me. I swallowed hard, but I climbed up anyway. Each step creaked. When I reached the second floor, the sound stopped. I stared at the attic door, waiting. Nothing. I went to my bedroom, locked the door again, and sat on the bed. My heart wouldn't slow down. I couldn't shake the feeling that something in this house was observing me. I lay down, still fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling. My mind replayed the sight of all those clocks set to the same time. I thought about the strange chimes. I worried that I was losing my grip. I stared at my phone's clock, watching the minutes pass normally. Eventually I dozed off, but it was a shallow sleep. I woke once at 3 a.m. and listened for the chimes. The house was quiet. I waited a few minutes, eyes on the door, then drifted off again. When morning came, my body felt stiff, and I had a dull headache. I got up, splashed water on my face in the bathroom, and decided I would make one final pass through the attic and the rest of the house to finish my cataloging as quickly as possible. I climbed to the attic with the intention of packing up all the clocks and boxes. When I walked in, I noticed more clocks were missing from the shelves. The few that were left, still displayed, I found empty boxes I hadn't touched before. It looked like something had moved them aside. I grabbed my phone, took pictures of the shelves, and tried to gather as many clocks as I could carry. I placed them in a large crate, sealed it, and dragged it toward the attic door. I heard a loud clang behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering, and saw that a small metal clock had fallen off a shelf onto the floor. I picked it up, and the face still red. I was breathing heavily, and I felt sweat running down my back. I put the clock on top of the crate and hurried down the attic steps. When I reached the second floor hallway, I felt a sudden blast of cold air. I nearly lost my grip on the crate. My knees felt shaky, but I managed to get the crate to the bedroom. I planned to pack my suitcase and drive away even if I had to come back later. I went downstairs to get another box. The living room light was on, but it flickered. I saw at least 5 clocks now positioned on the floor around the coffee table. Each showed 4. They weren't there the night before. I tried to ignore them, picked up the empty box and headed back upstairs. As I moved, I heard a series of faint ticks coming from behind me. I walked faster, my pulse pounding in my ears. I placed the box with the crate in the bedroom. Then I realized the bedroom door had swung shut on its own. I didn't remember closing it. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a reminder to check out of the house by the next day. I glanced at the screen. It showed the actual time, close to 10. I decided to collect my belongings and leave. I didn't care about the rest of the job. The tension in my chest felt overwhelming. I dashed around, grabbed my notes, stuffed them into my suitcase, and zipped it shut. I kept checking over my shoulder, worried I'd see another clock appear. On my way down the stairs, I heard another clang. I felt sure it was coming from the grandfather clock. I walked to it, pressed my hand against the front panel, and yanked open the door. Nothing moved inside. The pendulum was still. The face read 4. I slammed the door shut and hurried to the front entrance. The door opened with a scraping noise, and I stepped outside into the daylight. My heart still raced, but the fresh air felt good. I carried my suitcase to the car, tossed it in the trunk, and got in the driver's seat. So I felt tension in my arms and neck. I started the engine and pulled away from that house. Even as I drove off, I couldn't shake the sensation that the clocks were still watching me, locked on that impossible hour. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something behind me. But the road was clear, and I saw nothing unusual. All I could do was keep driving, trying to ignore the tension in my chest and the memory of those o-plugging chimes that echoed in my head all night. Even now, I can forget the way every single hand was stuck at 400 no matter what I tried. I don't know how it happened or why they did it, but I know I never want to see that house or hear those clocks ever again. I still remember how everything felt heavier that night, like the air inside the hotel was pressing against my chest. I'd come here for a simple business trip. I had my itinerary, I had my schedule, and I had a plan. But none of that mattered when my curiosity took over. The old closed-off wing of the hotel had been bothering me since the first day I arrived. It was an entire hallway, sealed behind a rope, and a no-entry sign. The staff told me it wasn't safe. They said it had bad wiring and that the floorboards were old. That made me want to see it even more. The hotel was full of tall windows, thick carpets, and vintage wallpaper. During the day, sunlight poured through high windows in the lobby and lit up the polished wooden banisters. People moved around with their suitcases and work folders. It felt alive. At night, everything changed. Long corridors stretched out with dim, warm lamps, giving off a quiet, unsettling atmosphere. I never heard any strange sounds or anything, but something about those halls got under my skin. On my second night, I passed by that closed-off wing around 10 p.m. I saw the rope, the dusty floor beyond it, and the sign warning guests to keep out. An urge kicked in. I told myself I'd just take a quick look. My heart was racing. The rest of the hotel was calm. I could hear the distant hum of the lobby's large air conditioning system, but nobody was around to see me slip under the rope. My palms were sweating by the time I set foot on the old carpet in the closed hallway. I had my phone flashlight ready, but the corridor lights were still on, just dim and flickering. The walls here had peeling wallpaper and a stale smell. The place felt abandoned. I took a few steps forward, listening to the faint buzz of a dead light bulb overhead. The boards under the carpet creaked with each step. There was no sign of recent maintenance, no signs of housekeeping. Doors along the hallway had chipped paint, and many had old room under renovation signs hanging at odd angles. I turned back for a moment, thinking I should maybe just return to my room. But something kept me there. I took a few more steps. My phone buzzed with a notification, but the screen went dark almost immediately after. I tried to turn it on again. It flashed the home screen for a second and then shut off. My battery was at least half full earlier, so it didn't make sense. I walked further, relying on the corridor lights that flickered and hummed. There was a stale odor in the air, like old furniture and damp cardboard. The deeper I went, the more I felt a slight pressure at the back of my head, like a tension headache forming. I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was the stress from work or poor air circulation. The feeling wasn't painful, just distracting. I passed a few closed doors. The brass handles were dull with age. I tried one door, but it was locked. I tried another, same thing. I kept going until I reached a corner where the hallway turned left. Around the corner, the light seemed dimmer. My chest got tight and my breathing shallow. I told myself I just wanted to see around that corner and then leave. When I finally peeked around, I saw a longer hallway with a row of lights that flickered in and out. The floor stretched farther than I expected. It looked endless for a moment. My eyes locked onto that distance. That's when I felt the first wave of something strange. It was a kind of emptiness in my head, like a momentary lapse in memory. I forgot what time it was, and I forgot if I had locked my suitcase back in my room. It took me a second to recall that I had left it closed but not locked. That small confusion made me uneasy. My mouth felt dry. I took a deep breath and stepped into this new stretch of the corridor. There was a buzzing sound from somewhere above, like a loose electrical fixture. My footsteps sounded heavier as I moved forward. A small flicker of panic rose in my chest. I tried to remind myself which room I was staying in. My room number was 206. I had to really think for a moment. Wait, it's definitely 206, I told myself. But I wasn't sure. I tried to think of my name. That sounds ridiculous, but I caught myself hesitating. My name is... I actually paused. My name is Daniel. I repeated it, muttering under my breath. Daniel. That quick sense of forgetting was terrifying. I felt a cold sweat forming on my forehead, and my hands started trembling. Part of me wanted to turn around immediately and run back. But I couldn't ignore the curiosity either. I didn't see any reason for this bizarre memory lapse, and that made me want to figure it out. It felt like the hallway was messing with my head. I heard a faint clicking sound, like a door latch being tested. I spun around. I didn't see anyone. There were only the old doors, the flickering lights, and that dusty carpet. My stomach tightened. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded shaky. Nobody answered. I tried the nearest doorknob. It was locked. The door next to it was also locked. My heart was pounding. I began to feel an urge to get out. But when I looked back, the hallway I had come from seemed different. It felt longer, and the lights were dimmer than before. I walked briskly in that direction. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. Each step made the boards creak. The corridor felt stretched, like I had to walk more steps than I had taken before. A mild headache set in. I reached the corner, expecting to see the rope and the sign. Instead, there was just another stretch of corridor with closed doors. I was sure I should have been at the exit by then. My pulse throbbed in my temples. I tried to stay calm. I reminded myself of my name again. Daniel. I'm on a business trip. My room is... I was guessing. I couldn't recall whether it was 24. My mind went blank. I wiped sweat from my brow. My suit jacket felt too tight around my shoulders, so I loosened my tie and looked around for any sign of a stairwell or elevator. The lights above flickered again, and the hum intensified. I felt pressure building in my ears. I swallowed hard, trying to relieve it. I thought about leaving my briefcase in my room but couldn't remember if I had left it there. All these small details slipped away, like someone had plucked them out of my brain. I started walking again, this time faster. I tried each door as I passed. All were locked. My breathing got heavier. My legs felt shaky. The flickering lights cast sharp shadows on the walls. I heard a soft scraping sound behind me, like something brushed against the wall. I turned around quickly, almost stumbling. The corridor was empty. My throat was tight. I forced myself to keep going. Every time I looked back, the place seemed to stretch another few feet. My watch said it was around 10:15 p.m., but it felt later. I couldn't tell how long I'd been walking. I tried to recall the date, but got stuck. My palms were damp with sweat. The emptiness in my head got worse. I could remember my first name, but not my middle name. I used to know it clearly. Now it was gone. I pressed forward, checking the brass plaques on the doors. They were covered with dust and grime, making the numbers hard to read. The lights overhead kept flickering, making the plaques even harder to see. Some read 258, 2210, 212. But they didn't look like active rooms. They were worn out. I tried each handle, but none moved. My breath came in short gasps. I felt my muscles tense. My shoulders were stiff and my neck felt sore. My tie was choking me. I tore it off and let it drop to the floor. It hit the carpet with a soft thump. There was a strange thought that maybe I shouldn't leave it behind, but I didn't want to bend down and pick it up. I wanted to keep moving. The humming grew louder. I realized I could see small sparks around some of the light fixtures. I sniffed the air, worried about a fire, but smelled only that stale odor. I pressed on, my eyes darting left and right for any sign of a staircase. My heart beat drummed in my ears. I looked behind me again. The corridor stretched out before me, lights flickering. It looked the same in both directions. I felt a moment of dizziness. I put a hand on the wall to steady myself. I closed my eyes and tried to concentrate on my name and where I was. I'm Daniel. I'm in a hotel. I came here for a business meeting tomorrow. The meeting is with Liao. I paused. I couldn't remember the company. My hand shook as I pressed it against the wall. The wallpaper was peeling, and I felt the rough surface underneath. A squeaking noise broke the silence. I opened my eyes and looked around, but all the doors were shut. The corridor was empty. My breathing was shallow and quick. I whispered my name again. It felt like a tiny thread tying me to reality. Then I saw a faint light at the end of the corridor. It was different from the flickering lamps. It was steadier, almost like a desk lamp shining through an open doorway. I hurried forward, hoping that maybe it was a service area or small lounge. My legs felt tired, but I forced them to move. As I got closer, I realized the door was slightly ajar. The plaque was so worn I couldn't read it. The light inside was yellowish. I pushed the door open carefully and stepped inside. The room smelled of dust and old upholstery. There was a single lamp on a side table, with no shade, just a bare bulb that flickered softly, but not like the ones outside. Against one wall stood a musty couch, and in front of it was a round coffee table. No windows. I walked in, closing the door behind me, hoping to shut out that endless hallway. My head felt a bit clearer in here, though not perfect. I wiped my sweat with my jacket sleeve. The couch looked sturdy enough, so I sat down. I tried my phone again, but it was still dead. The panic in my chest settled a little, just enough for me to notice the dryness in my mouth. I swallowed and tasted dust. I thought about leaving this room, but the idea of going back into that hallway made my stomach twist. Instead, I stayed seated, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees. I tried to recall my last name. It took me a moment. Finally, it came back. Daniel Foster, I said out loud. That gave me a small jolt of relief. I tried to remember my hotel room number again, but it was a blur. Maybe 2, I muttered to myself. I had to focus on not letting the corridor get to me again. After a few minutes, I decided to stand up. I needed to find a way out. I opened the door a crack. The hallway lights were still flickering, but the corridor didn't look endless now. I saw a sign on the wall at the far end, near a corner. It looked like a small metal plaque that might indicate a staircase or something similar. I forced myself to step back out. My legs felt shaky, and my mind was screaming at me to be careful. I moved down the hall towards the sign. I kept my eyes straight ahead, ignoring the creaking sounds behind me. The sign read, "Maintenance Stairwell." The door next to it was plain metal and had a push bar. So I pressed it. At first it didn't budge. I leaned my shoulder into it, and it gave way with a loud shriek of rusted hinges. Inside there was a narrow staircase with concrete steps, and a single bulb hanging overhead. It looked neglected, but I could see the bottom. No flickering lights here. I hurried down, one hand on the metal railing. It felt solid. My breathing was fast, but I felt a sense of relief. At the bottom, there was another metal door. I pushed it open, and I stumbled into the main lobby area near the back offices. The lights were on. The carpet here was clean. I turned around to look at the door I came through. It had a big sign, "Employees Only, Maintenance Access." I stood there breathing hard. My heart pounded and sweat was soaking my shirt collar. A security guard noticed me and walked over. He looked concerned, asked me if I was all right. I couldn't explain what I just experienced. I just said I'd gotten lost. He told me that area wasn't safe, then he guided me towards the elevator. The ride up to my floor felt like it took forever, but at least the air was fresh. I kept telling myself my name in my head. I was terrified that I might forget again. When I finally reached my floor, I walked down the hallway until I saw my suitcase parked by the door or room. I tried the keycard and the lock clicked green. That small click felt like a victory. Inside, the lights were normal. My suitcase was on the stand, unzipped. I quickly looked at my phone charger on the nightstand. I plugged in my phone and watched the screen power up, half battery just as I remembered. I let out a shaky sigh. I locked the door, double-checked it, and peeled off my sweaty suit. I grabbed a towel from the bathroom to wipe my face. My reflection in the mirror looked pale, my eyes wide, my mouth felt dry, and my lips were cracked. I kept thinking about how easily my memory had slipped away in that corridor. It felt unreal, but my racing heart told me it happened. I could still feel that tension in the back of my head. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the carpet, taking slow, controlled breaths. I tried to piece everything together. The endless hallway, the flickering lights, the locked doors, the sense of being pulled deeper, the way my thoughts vanished. I took one more look outside just to confirm I was really in my hallway. Everything was normal. I could hear an ice machine humming at the far end. That weird stale smell was gone. The floor was bright. The paint was fresh. There was no sign of that suffocating presence I'd felt. I closed my door again. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind refused to settle down. But I didn't leave my room. When morning finally came, I had a headache and felt exhausted. I had to keep up appearances for my business meeting, so I got dressed and went downstairs. The staff greeted me politely, but I noticed them glance at my pale face. I checked out later that afternoon, even though my initial plan was to stay another night. I packed my things and left. I didn't talk about that corridor to anyone else. I just wanted to get out of that building. On my drive away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that long, flickering hallway behind me somehow. But all I saw was a normal road. Eventually, I turned on the radio and tried to focus on the present. My mind still felt cloudy, but my memories were back in place. Even now, thinking about that night makes my stomach twist. It wasn't about ghosts or strange figures. It was about losing my grip on who I was. I don't have a logical explanation for it. I only know that I never want to experience anything like it again. I still get chills when I remember how the hallway seemed to expand, how my name nearly slipped away, and how my room number became some distant, confusing detail. If I had stayed there any longer, I'm not sure how much of myself I would have lost. That's why I left, and never looked back. I arrived just before sunset, and the cabin looked smaller than I expected. The owner handed me a single key on a rusty keychain. He said he didn't come around often and that I was free to call him if I needed anything. He kept it short and left in a hurry. I stood on the short wooden porch, looking out at the swamp behind the cabin. The water was dark and still, except for a thin film on the surface that reflected the last bit of orange light in the sky. The place smelled stale, like wet leaves in mold. I didn't mind that smell at first. I came here to write, and I thought I could handle a bit of damp air and quiet nights. I carried my single bag and a box of groceries inside. The inside of the cabin was cramped. There was one narrow bed, a small table with 2 chairs, and a short counter that doubled as a kitchen. The walls had brown stains near the floor. I guess the swamp water rose occasionally during floods. Everything felt a little clammy, like the moisture had soaked into every piece of wood. There was a small stove in the corner, an old gas model that looked well used. I checked the cabinets and found a few plates, a cup, and some mismatched utensils. The electricity worked, though the single bulb in the ceiling flickered. The sound of the swamp outside came through the thin walls. I heard frogs croaking. Something else hissed in the weeds. I got a small shiver, but I told myself it was just nerves from being alone in a new place. I unpacked my laptop and set it on the little table. When I tried to connect to the internet, I found there was no signal. The phone reception was also weak. I could make calls, but it took a minute for the phone to register any bars. I didn't worry too much. I planned on focusing on my writing, and distractions wouldn't help. Still, the loneliness of the place felt stronger without any connection to the outside world. When the sun finally went down, the swamp outside turned black. I walked out onto the porch. The moon was high, and a thick fog stretched across the water. I heard something splash on the far side of the swamp, but I couldn't see anything. There was a dull glow in the fog, like faint lanterns moving near the surface. I squinted, trying to figure out if they were fireflies or reflections of the moon, but they looked bigger than fireflies. They swayed a little, sometimes vanishing behind the fog, then coming back. My heart pounded a bit faster. I watched those lights for a full minute. I held my breath, waiting to see if they would move toward me. They stayed in the same area, drifting slowly. I decided to head down to the edge of the swamp. The ground was soft under my boots. It felt spongy, like walking on an old mattress. As I reached the water, the smell got stronger. A heavy sour smell, like rotten vegetation mixed with stagnant water. The fog clung to the weeds, and I had to lean forward to see anything. Those lights flickered about 50 yards out. I tried to listen for voices, but all I heard was a muffled croaking from frogs and the whisper of wind through the reeds. I thought I heard something shift under my feet, like water flowing under a thin crust of mud. I gritted my teeth and took a step back. My arms felt tense, and my heart rate picked up. I realized I was alone in a place I barely knew. The lights remained there, still flickering. I decided it was time to get back to the cabin. Inside, I tried to focus on writing, but my mind kept going back to the strange lights outside. I typed a few sentences, then got frustrated and shut the laptop. The single light bulb above me buzzed, and I flicked it off, annoyed by the flicker. I lit an old oil lamp I found in a corner cabinet. Its flame was steady, and the cabin grew dim and warm. After a while, I noticed a faint sound coming from outside. It was like distant murmuring, soft but persistent. I held my breath and tried to make it out. It stopped suddenly. I set the lamp on the small table, stood still, and waited. The murmuring began again, like 2 people whispering underwater. A chill rolled through my body. I felt goosebumps on my arms. I locked the door, then realized how flimsy it felt. It was just thin wood with a basic lock. I pulled the small table closer to the entrance, thinking it might slow someone down if they tried to come in. I didn't sleep well that first night. I left the oil lamp lit, turning it down just enough so I could see shadows on the walls. Every time I shut my eyes, I pictured those foggy lights. I pictured shapes moving in the reeds. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke up to total silence. The lamp had burned out, leaving a faint smell of smoke. My back was sore from the old mattress. Gray light filtered through the single window above the bed. I could see the damp marks on the ceiling, some water stains running down the walls. I pushed the blanket aside, got up, and felt a small headache pulsing behind my eyes. I decided to walk around the swamp area in daylight to get a better idea of my surroundings. The morning air was thick and humid. I could taste the sour tang on my lips. I noticed that the grass and weeds were taller than I thought. There were low trees with twisted trunks, half submerged in the water. The mud near the water's edge sucked at my boots, making a sucking noise when I lifted my feet. I found a small clearing near the side of the cabin that sloped into the swamp. The ground there was more solid. The water was covered in green algae, broken in places by small pockets of black water. I looked for any sign of animals or people. I saw a few frogs sitting on a log and a snake slithering away when it spotted me. There were no footprints or signs of human activity. Everything felt still, but I noticed an undercurrent of life. Tiny insects buzzed by my ears. I heard ripples that told me fish or something else was moving just beneath the water's surface. I spent most of the day trying to write. I made some lunch using canned food, then sat at the table and typed. I felt claustrophobic. The walls and the low ceiling pressed in on me, and the swamp smell seeped in through the cracks. I heard little gurgles outside as if the swamp was breathing. At around mid-afternoon, I decided to open the windows for some fresh air. The breeze didn't help. It was just more wet air, but I left them open anyway, hoping to chase out the stale odor inside. My stomach felt uneasy, probably from the smell and the tension. I couldn't stop thinking about those lights. Around dusk, I stepped outside again. The fog was already forming in thin ribbons across the surface of the swamp. My boots sank into the spongy ground. I listened for any unusual sounds. I heard the usual frogs and insects. Then I noticed a faint scraping noise, like reeds brushing against something solid. I walked along the water's edge, trying to keep my footsteps quiet. My heartbeat was steady but strong. My hands were sweating. The sky turned a deep purple. The moon started to rise, and the fog grew thicker. I saw the lights again. There were 3 distinct glows this time, moving in slow circles about the same distance out. They were closer to each other, drifting in a pattern I couldn't explain. I thought about wading in, but the idea made my stomach clench. I didn't trust that water, and I had no clue how deep it was. I stayed on the shore, watching. Suddenly I heard that whispering again. It was softer this time, like it was muffled by the fog. My head felt light, and my mouth went dry. I crouched down behind a patch of tall grass, trying to see if anyone was out there. I saw no silhouettes, just thick reeds in that drifting fog. The whispering lasted for a few seconds, then stopped. I stood up, wiped the sweat from my forehead, and hurried back to the cabin. Inside, I bolted the door and turned on the single light. It flickered, making my nerves worse. I took out my flashlight and tested it. The batteries were still good. I placed it on the table next to me. I sat down, tried to calm my breathing, and thought about calling the cabin owner. But what would I say? That I saw strange lights and heard odd sounds. He'd probably dismiss it as swamp gas or local wildlife. I was stuck with the cabin for the time being, and I still wanted peace to write. A part of me thought it was just my nerves, but my gut told me there was something else going on. That night, the whispering got louder. It started around midnight. It rose and fell like waves. I could almost make out words, but they were muffled, like someone speaking through a wall. My hands shook. I sat in bed with the flashlight pointed at the door. My chest felt tight. I imagined shapes moving outside the window. Every so often I heard a tapping on the side of the cabin, like someone running their fingernails against the wood. My mind raced. I considered packing up and leaving right then, but it was dark, and a narrow dirt road back to the highway felt too risky. I told myself I'd wait until morning. At some point I must have dozed off again. I woke up sweating. It was nearly dawn. The whispering had stopped. My jaw was sore from clenching my teeth. My arms ached and my lower back felt stiff. I got up, gulped down some water from the faucet, and rinsed my face in the sink. I stared at myself in the tiny mirror above the sink. I looked tired, with dark circles under my eyes. I could feel the strain in my face. After breakfast, I stepped outside. The air was thick and smelled even worse, almost like sulfur. I decided to follow the edge of the swamp in the other direction, hoping to see where the lights might be coming from. The undergrowth was dense, and I had to push my way through reeds and small shrubs. A few times my boots slipped into mud up to my ankle. My shirt stuck to my back, and insects buzzed around my ears. I heard small animals scurrying away as I approached. I didn't see any other cabins or signs of people. The swamp stretched out in patches of water and thick vegetation. Some trees were leaning, and their roots were half exposed. There was a sense of decay everywhere. I came back to the cabin after an hour or so, feeling frustrated. I hadn't found anything that explained those lights or voices. I wondered if there might be an old boat or a hidden trail somewhere, but I didn't see anything. I spent the afternoon riding again. My focus kept drifting. Each time the cabin creaked or I heard a strange sound outside, I froze waiting for something to happen. My nerves were on edge, and I felt this tension in my stomach that wouldn't go away. That evening, the fog rolled in earlier than usual. It crept across the water and spread onto the bank surrounding the cabin. I went outside with my flashlight just before total darkness. The beam cut through the fog, showing only about 10 feet of visibility. Beyond that, it was a wall of gray. I heard a splash near the water. I aimed my flashlight, but all I saw were ripples. My heart pounded, and my mouth went dry again. I turned around, and for a split second I thought I saw a shape moving behind the reeds. It looked like a tall figure leaning forward, but it vanished when I pointed the light. I backed away, keeping the beam directed at where I'd seen the shape. The swamp was silent again. I hurried inside. I locked the door and wedged a chair under the doorknob, even though it felt silly. My hands shook so much that I dropped the flashlight once. I turned off the electric light and used the oil lamp again. The darkness outside was thick. The fog pressed against the windows. The glass was streaked with condensation, making the interior feel like a damp cave. At around 9 p.m. the whispering returned, louder than the night before. It sounded like multiple voices all speaking at once, but I couldn't make out words. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my laptop, but the noise seeped into my mind. My breathing got shallow. My chest tightened. I felt sweat dripping down my temples. At around midnight, I heard a distinct thud against the cabin wall. I jumped up, knocking over the chair. My heart hammered in my chest. The whispering grew more urgent, like it was just outside the door. I grabbed my flashlight, walked to the door, and pressed my ear against it. I heard what sounded like water dripping. I heard the shuffle of feet, or maybe just movement in the mud. My mind raced. I considered yelling for whoever was out there to go away, but I was scared of drawing more attention. My mouth felt like sandpaper. I could hardly swallow. I don't know how long I stood there, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 30. The sounds eventually faded. The whispering subsided, replaced by the usual drone of insects. I stayed on alert, flashlight in hand, until dawn's light appeared through the window. My whole body felt drained, like I'd been fighting off an invisible attacker all night. My hands were stiff from gripping the flashlight, and my neck ached from tension. The moment I saw enough light outside, I gathered my things, stuffing my laptop and clothes into my bag. I left a note for the owner on the table saying I had to leave early. I didn't care if I lost the deposit. I just wanted to get out of there. My stomach was in knots, and my pulse was still racing. I stepped onto the porch. The swamp looked calm and gray in the early morning light, with the fog hovering just above the water. I heard a small splash in the distance, but it didn't matter. I walked to my car, which was parked a short distance from the cabin. The ground felt soggy under my boots, and I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something emerging from the reeds. I got in the car and started the engine. As soon as I pulled away from that cabin, I felt a weight lift off my chest. The dirt road was muddy, but I managed to navigate it without getting stuck. In my rearview mirror, I saw the swamp fading into the distance. The cabin's roof was barely visible through the low trees. My hands were still shaking on the steering wheel, but I drove until I reached the main highway. I stopped at the first gas station I found and took a long breath. My shirt was damp with sweat, and my eyes felt heavy. I got out, stretched, and looked at my reflection in the gas station window. I looked exhausted. My mind kept replaying the whispers, those lights on the water, and the strange tapping on the cabin walls. Even after leaving, I could still feel a kind of pressure in my chest, like I hadn't fully escaped that place. But at least I was out, and I didn't plan on going back. I didn't see any reason to try to explain it to anyone. I was just glad to be off that property. I got back in my car, turned onto the highway, and felt the tension in my shoulders ease as I picked up speed. My only plan was to find another place to stay, somewhere without a swamp. without fog that hid flickering lights, and without those voices that seeped through the mud and weeds. I wanted to put as much distance as possible between me and that cabin. I drove, watching the miles tick by on the odometer, refusing to look back. I stepped into that old building with a quick nod to the caretaker outside. Had given me a brief greeting, then waved me through the front doors. The place had been abandoned for years, and I was there to evaluate its structural integrity. The owners wanted to restore it and possibly turn it into a venue for events. My job was to walk around, check the walls, look for cracks, examine the beams, and note down any concerns. I expected it to be a routine task, 5 hours at most, then I'd be out of there. But the moment I walked into the foyer, I noticed a stale odor like old fabric and mildew. The air was heavy. The caretaker gave me one last look before stepping out to take a call. When I glanced back, I realized the doors had closed behind me. My chest felt tight, but I pushed the feeling aside and turned on my flashlight. I moved down the main hallway and tried to see how deep the place went. The floors creaked with every step. Bits of plaster had fallen off the walls in several places. Dust covered most surfaces. It was an enormous space with wide corridors that led to different wings. It used to host majestic balls, as I'd been told. People came here dressed in luxurious outfits. They danced, drank, and enjoyed big gatherings under chandeliers. Now those chandeliers were gone or broken, and the only remnants of those days were fragments of fabric, scattered furniture, and a smell that reminded me of forgotten closets. I was walking towards a large room on the right when I saw something on the walls. At first I thought it was some type of artwork or decoration. As I stepped closer, I realized they were masks. Dozens of masks, each one with strange facial features. Some had crooked mouths. Others had narrow, slanted eye holes. A few had elaborate designs, but they all looked unsettling because of the dust and darkness around them. I inhaled through my nose and felt my stomach tighten a bit. There was something about how those masks were displayed. They were hanging at different angles, some higher, some lower. A few were missing pieces, like broken edges or chipped paint. I glanced over them with my flashlight, then wrote in my notebook. Masks on walls, potential original decor, check for possible salvage or repair. I moved on, trying not to think too much about their odd shapes. I entered a vast ballroom. The ceiling was high, and I saw exposed beams near the top. The place smelled damp, and I heard my own breathing echo off the walls. That's when I felt a chill on the back of my neck. It wasn't a breeze. The air felt thick, almost stagnant. I froze for a second. I listened. I thought maybe I'd hear something like footsteps, but it was dead silent. My pulse sped up. I told myself it was just the weird atmosphere getting to me. I turned around and scanned the room with my flashlight. On the far side, near a broken window, I saw something that made my throat tighten. One of the masks from the hallway was leaning against a fallen chair. The mask had a twisted expression like it was sneering. I was certain I hadn't seen it there before. I tried to remember if I'd accidentally bumped a display or something, causing the mask to drop or roll in. But I hadn't touched anything in the hallway. I swallowed hard and decided I'd just make a note of it. I wrote, mask found on floor in main ballroom, possibly detached from wall. Then I stepped over to pick it up. The mask felt weird in my hands. The wood was cold and rough. The eyes were cut out in a rectangular shape. I didn't like the way it looked. It felt like I was holding a face with no life in it, yet I felt watched. I turned it away and carried it to one of the tables on the side. Setting it down gently, I told myself to keep moving. I checked some of the woodwork on the columns, noted that some were rotting. I took photos with my phone, used the flashlight to check cracks in the plaster, and tested the stability of the floor in several spots. About half an hour later, I made my way back to the foyer. I wanted to grab my water bottle, which I'd left near the entrance. As I passed the hallway with the masks, something caught my attention. At first I couldn't figure out what was off. Then I noticed that one of the hooks was empty. It looked like there had been a mask hanging there, but it was gone. My arms tensed. I rubbed the back of my neck and tried to stay calm. Maybe it was the mask I'd found in the ballroom. That would make sense. Still, something felt off. I drank some water and decided to check the left wing. The caretaker had told me there was a smaller parlor there, and a storage room. I stepped through a narrow passage. The walls here were closer together, and the smell was worse. The floor had patches of dampness, and I felt the boards flex under my feet. My flashlight flickered once, so I tapped it, cursing under my breath. I reached the parlor. It was smaller, with drapes that had once been red, now turned a brownish color. A cracked mirror stood against the far wall. Chairs were stacked in a corner. I spotted more masks. They were on a small table, covered in dust. They all had that same unnatural style. Unpleasant angles, strange eye slits, distorted mouths. I didn't want to look at them for too long. I jotted down some notes about the room's condition and left. Eventually, the day wore on. My phone showed it was after 6 p.m. The caretaker said he'd lock up at 7, but I told him I needed more time. He handed me a set of keys and said, "Just make sure to lock the front doors when you're done. He'll be back tomorrow morning." Then he left. I wasn't thrilled to be alone in there after dark, but I needed to finish the assessment. By 8 p.m., it was pitch black outside. The building had no power, so I relied on my flashlight. I was in one of the smaller ballrooms, writing down the measurements of the columns and noting the ceiling height when I felt that chill again. This time, my hair stood on end. I heard a soft sound like fabric dragging on the floor. I turned around quickly, shining my flashlight across the room. Nothing, just empty space and dust particles in the beam of light. My heart was pounding. I told myself it might have been wind coming through a broken window or maybe a piece of cloth on the ground that I shifted unknowingly. But I didn't see anything like that. I decided it was time to pack up for the night. I felt uneasy. I started walking toward the main hall, stepping carefully around loose floorboards. My flashlight flickered again, and I tapped it a few times before it went out completely. I cursed and slapped it a few more times, but nothing happened. My phone's flashlight was my backup, so I pulled my phone out and switched it on. The beam was weaker, but at least I had some light. My footsteps sounded louder in the dark. Every board that creaked made my pulse jump. I wiped sweat from my brow and kept moving. As I entered the main hall, something caught my eye by the wall. It was that same mask with the twisted expression. It was on the floor again, facing me, right in the middle of the path. I stopped and pointed my phone at it. I was sure I'd left it on a table hours ago. I remembered placing it there after picking it up in the ballroom. Now it was right here, turned toward me. I felt a sudden tightening in my chest. My breath came in short bursts. I walked forward slowly, kneeling to get a better look. The mask was dusty and the eye holes pointed directly at me. I felt a wave of nausea. It was just an object, but it seemed like it was waiting for me. I reached out and picked it up again. My hand was trembling. I tried to stay calm, telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it slid off the table. Maybe there was a slight tilt in the floor. I stood up, holding it at arm's length. Then I looked at the empty hooks on the wall. There were at least 3 vacant spots. I hadn't noticed that many before. I scanned the area with my phone's flashlight, but I didn't see any other masks on the ground. I decided to walk the mask back to the hallway where I first saw it. My idea was to hang it on a hook and see if it stayed there overnight. I started along the corridor, stepping on loose tiles. My footsteps echoed. I felt like each step took too long, like I was trudging through thick air. Finally, I reached the section with the other masks. I found an empty hook and placed the twisted mask on it. As soon as I let go, I got a shiver down my spine. I don't know why, but I felt watched again. My breath fell short. My palms were sweaty. I took a step back and aimed my phone at the mask. It hung there, motionless. I stared at it for a few seconds, then forced myself to keep walking toward the exit. The foyer was right around the corner. The caretaker had left the lights off. I noticed the faint glow from outside streetlights coming through the glass in the doors. I felt relief. I checked my watch. It was almost night. I walked quickly to the main doors, grabbing my backpack from the corner. I fished the caretaker's keys out of my pocket. I clicked off my phone's flashlight for a moment, wanting to see if the outside light was enough to guide me. I could make out the shapes of chairs and a dusty reception desk. That's when I noticed something else, a slight movement to my right. I turned my phone's flashlight back on and shone it in that direction. There was nothing there, just a narrow hallway with plaster peeling off the walls. I realized I was shaking a bit, so I clenched my jaw and pulled the door handle. When I tried to open the door, it gave a bit, but then stuck. It felt jammed. I tried turning the key in the lock, but it wouldn't budge. I looked at the mechanism. It seemed rusted. I muttered a few curses under my breath, then jiggled it again. The lock finally clicked. but the door still didn't open more than an inch. There was probably debris or something on the outside. I didn't want to waste more time, so I locked it again and thought I'd try one of the side entrances. The caretaker had mentioned that there were other exits. I remembered seeing a small door in the corridor near the bathrooms, so I headed in that direction. As I made my way back through the dark halls, I turned my phone's flashlight on and off, trying to save battery.
I heard my own breathing echo again.
My footsteps sounded too loud. At one point I smelled something musty and realized it was probably the old curtains or rotting floorboards. It was the same hallway with the masks. I tried not to look at them, but my eyes drifted over. I counted each mask. 1, 2, 3. I paused. There was an empty hook on the end. I looked closer and realized the twisted mask was gone again. My lungs tightened and sweat broke out on my forehead. I stood there listening for any sound. I felt exposed. My breathing was harsh and uneven. I whispered to myself, "It's just a building. It's just an old building." I turned the flashlight toward the floor. I saw footprints in the dust. Some were mine, but there were marks I didn't recognize, like sliding trails or partial prints. My heart raced. I forced myself to move forward, telling myself that I'd find the side door and get out of there. The corridor stretched on. Eventually, I reached the area near the restrooms. The side door was visible at the end. It was made of heavy wood and looked less used. I hurried toward it, but then I spotted something leaning against the wall by the corner. My throat tightened. It was the mask, upright, as if someone had placed it there. Its empty eyes faced me. I started to breathe in quick, shallow spurts, and my hands felt clammy. I tried to ignore it and went straight to the door. I turned the handle. It opened a crack, then stopped. Something was blocking it from outside, maybe a piece of debris or a fallen branch. I pushed harder, but it barely moved. I tried kicking at the base, but it still wouldn't open enough to squeeze through. I stepped back, feeling my heart hammer in my chest. My shirt was damp around my collar from sweat. My mouth felt dry, and I could taste the stale air with every breath. I glanced at the mask again. It hadn't moved, but it seemed like it was glaring at me. My mind started racing. I thought about maybe using one of the windows. Some were broken, but most had boards or thick wooden frames. I needed to check them. I walked quickly. My phone battery was down to I found a window in the hallway that looked like it might open. It was tall, but the latch was rusted. I yanked on it, putting all my weight into it, until it finally gave way and opened a few inches. I could see the faint lights outside, but there was a metal grate on the other side. I hit it with my hand and realized it was probably too solid to remove without tools. At that point, I felt a wave of panic. My face was hot, and my breathing was quick. I pulled out my phone and tried calling the caretaker. The call didn't go through. No signal. Maybe the walls were too thick. I tried texting, but it wouldn't send. I looked at the time. It was almost night. I told myself I just needed to find another exit or maybe find a way to push the front door open from the outside. There had to be a solution. I spun around and aimed my light down the hallway. That's when I saw it. The mask was on the floor, a few feet behind me. It looked like it had been placed face up. My legs shook. My stomach lurched. I couldn't figure out how it got there without me hearing anything. My mind was shouting at me to get away from it. I took a step back and lost my balance slightly, stumbling into the wall. My phone nearly slipped out of my hand. I steadied myself and forced myself to walk past it. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to look at it. I just wanted out. I made it back to the main foyer. I yanked on the front doors again, pushing with my shoulder, but they wouldn't move more than an inch. I felt locked in. My chest was pounding so hard it hurt. My entire body was tense. I decided to break one of the smaller windows near the entrance. I saw a wooden chair in the corner. I lifted it, noticing how heavy it felt. My arms were shaky, but I swung the chair at the glass. The glass cracked, but didn't completely shatter. I heard my own grunt as I put my weight into another swing. More cracks spiderwebbed across the surface. A few pieces fell away, but the window had some reinforcing wire that kept it mostly intact. I tried 3 or 4 more times, but only managed to create a hole about the size of a soccer ball. It wasn't big enough for me to crawl through, and the frame was bolted to the wall. I stopped, panting, sweat dripping from my forehead. I rested the chair on the floor. My arms were burning, and my heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. The building was quiet. but I had this feeling that I wasn't alone. My phone battery was down to 2. I paced around the foyer, shining the light on the walls, ceiling and floor. Dust floated everywhere. I realized the caretaker wasn't coming back tonight. I needed to calm down and find a safe spot to wait until morning. Maybe I'd climb through the broken window if I could chip away at the glass, but I needed something heavier to break the wire. I checked around for tools, but all I found were old brooms and broken furniture. I tried to push away the thought of that mask, but every time I blinked, I pictured it in my head, those empty eyes, that twisted mouth. I forced myself to take deep breaths. Then I looked at the battered window again. I decided I'd keep trying. I raised the chair one more time, aimed for the same spot, and slammed it with all my strength. More glass fell, some wires bent, and I managed to widen the gap a bit. I kicked at the base of the frame, trying to dislodge it. Eventually I saw some metal screws start to pull away from the wall. The hole got a little bigger, but not by much. I heard a noise behind me like wood scraping on the floor. My whole body stiffened. I swung around, shining my phone's light there. It was a dark shape close to the reception desk. I couldn't see it clearly. I moved the light lower and realized the mask was lying there. It must have been near the corner, but now it was in plain view. I felt cold sweat on my neck. My hand shook as I kept the phone pointed in that direction. For a moment, I just stood there, listening to my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I didn't care what logic might explain it. I needed to get out, even if I had to break more windows or find another path. I grabbed the chair again and put everything I had into smashing the edges of the glass. Bits of glass rained down, clinking on the floor. The wires started to tear from the frame. I kept going, ignoring the sting in my hands when I accidentally grazed a shard. My breathing was ragged. Finally, I managed to pull the metal frame half off the wall. There was a gap big enough for me to squeeze through, though it was tight. I saw the sidewalk outside. My chest fluttered with relief. I turned for a second to grab my backpack. In the beam of my phone's light, I saw the mask sitting upright next to the reception desk. It was turned toward the window. I felt a spike of raw fear, like my veins were on fire. I didn't want to waste another second. I left the backpack and scrambled through the gap, twisting my body sideways. Broken glass scraped against my jacket. I stumbled onto the sidewalk, feeling the cool night air hit my face. My hands were shaking and I had small cuts on my arms, but I was out. I stood up, staring at the dark entrance behind me. The building was silent and looming. I locked eyes on that faint shape through the broken window. I thought I saw the mask just inside, lying where I'd left it. I couldn't be sure. I took off running down the sidewalk, not stopping until I reached my car. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locked the doors and started the engine. My heart was still racing. I glanced back at the building once. It looked empty and still, but I knew what I felt in there. I gripped the steering wheel, took a few shaking breaths, and pulled away. I didn't bother looking back again. I just drove, wiping the sweat off my face, convinced that if I had stayed any longer, I would have lost my mind in there. I decided I'd file my report later. Right then, I just wanted to get far away from that hole and those damned masks. I still remember the first time I heard that hissing sound. It was late, maybe past midnight. The streetlights were flickering like they do when the bulbs are almost shot. I was walking home from a friend's place, not really thinking about anything important. Then I passed the old bus station. It's been shut down for years. Some kind of budget cuts or zoning issue. There's a metal fence around it with signs warning people to keep out, but nobody patrols that area. It's just dark, silent, and covered in graffiti. At least it was silent until that night. I heard a long, low screech. It reminded me of a bus brake, the kind you get when a driver presses down hard at the end of a route. I looked around, expecting to see headlights or a pair of glowing brake lights, but there was nothing. The street was empty, no cars, no people, just that faint hissing echo. I felt a cold sensation in my stomach. It wasn't even winter yet, but my hands started shaking. I told myself it was nothing. I kept walking and forced my mind to shift to other thoughts, but it stayed with me, this odd certainty that something was there. Over the next few nights, I decided to change my usual route home. I didn't want to deal with that deserted block or that haunting noise again. But eventually, my curiosity got the better of me. I don't know why I needed to see if it would happen again. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. So I headed back there, at the same time and on the same route, and I stood across the street, right where the sidewalk ends and the bus station property begins. The place looked the same as always. The windows were shattered, the schedule boards were torn apart, and the rows of empty benches had layers of dust and old newspapers. But I stayed there, waiting for a sign. I must have waited 10 or 15 minutes. I listened to my own breathing, tried to stay calm, told myself I was being an idiot. Then it happened, a sharp hissing like a hydraulic release. It started soft, then got louder. I felt my pulse go crazy. I looked around, expecting to see a vehicle. I scanned the street to the left, then to the right. Not a single headlight. My heart pounded so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Then I saw a brief flicker in the distance. It was too faint to be a proper headlight. It was more like a quick flash, almost like a dying flashlight beam. It came from further down the road behind the fence near the bus lanes that led into the station. I walked a few steps closer, keeping my eyes locked on the spot. The light flicked again, like it was signaling. I heard another hiss. By then my palms were sweating. I felt my throat tighten. Something about that light and that hiss made me think of an old bus trying to pull in, as if there was a vehicle hidden in the darkness, waiting to complete its route. But I couldn't see any shape. I only saw the empty driveway, cracked pavement, and a lot of broken glass. I turned around and went home. My mind was racing, but I tried to sleep. I managed to get a couple of hours, but I woke up drenched in sweat. The next day, I told a coworker about it. He laughed it off and said I was probably letting my imagination run wild. Maybe he was right, but I couldn't shake this feeling that there was more to it. Over the next week, I kept returning to that spot. It became an obsession, if I'm honest. I would finish my shift, grab a quick dinner, and then head out again, always drifting to that rundown station. Each time I heard the hiss. Sometimes it was brief, sometimes it stretched long and low. Occasionally, I'd see that faint light flash. One night, I swear I saw the shadow of a figure near the far corner of the station, behind one of the shattered glass panels. It moved quickly, then disappeared. I couldn't get a good look, but it felt like someone was standing there watching me from inside. My gut told me to stop this. It wasn't doing me any good, but I couldn't. It was like I needed to know what was going on. I began to walk around the perimeter of the fence. I tried to see if there was a break where I could slip inside. The gate was locked, the chain thick and rusted. The fence itself was tall and topped with barbed wire. I found a few loose spots, but not enough to squeeze through without slicing myself up. The station building looked grimy, and most of the interior was dark, though sometimes I noticed a faint flicker of a fluorescent bulb, like something still had power in there. The city cut all utilities to the place years ago, so it didn't make sense. One night I felt a weird pressure in the air, like it was building up to something. The sky was overcast, and the streetlights were dimmer than usual. I stood near the fence, scanning the lot. I heard the hiss so loud this time that I jumped back and almost dropped my phone. It sounded like it was right behind me. I spun around, nothing there. My chest felt tight, and I fought the urge to run. My legs felt stiff, as if they didn't want to move. Then I noticed a flash of light on the far side of the station, the area where buses used to pull in. It flickered off and on like a weak strobe. I decided to approach the gate. I grabbed it with both hands and rattled it a bit, hoping to see if it would open. It stayed locked. When I peeked through the gaps in the chain, I noticed the outline of what could have been a bus. It was faint, more like a dark shape against the shadows. I blinked a few times, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. It didn't move, and I couldn't see details, but it felt too big to be a car or van. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes, my heart pounding. Then that shape vanished, like a light turned off. The lot went dark again except for a single flickering bulb near one of the station doors. I heard a scraping sound, like metal dragging across concrete. That's when I stepped back. Every part of me told me to get the hell out of there. I walked fast, almost jogging, until I reached a better lit block. My pulse was still racing, and my skin felt clammy. I wanted to get home, lock my door, and forget about this whole thing. But the next day, I went back, as if I was under some kind of spell. It felt strange, like an itch I couldn't scratch. I tried to keep my distance. I stood halfway down the block, just observing. The street was quiet. A few stray cats were digging through a trash bag near a closed restaurant. Empty of my own breathing. Then that hiss cut through the silence again. I saw a dull glow on the ground near the station's entrance, which pulsed twice and then went dark. A jolt of adrenaline coursed through my veins. My mouth went dry. Something about that station felt like it was calling me, but I couldn't figure out why. As the weeks passed, I started noticing new graffiti on the station walls. Words and symbols I hadn't seen before, all painted in harsh strokes. There was a fresh layer of shattered glass in some areas too. It looked like someone or something was tearing up the place at night. A few times, I saw faint footprints in the dust leading toward the old waiting room, but I never saw anyone actually inside. I tried telling a friend about the odd lights and sounds. He said maybe homeless people were squatting in there, making noises with old equipment. But there was something too rhythmic, too specific about that hissing sound. It happened at the same time each night, give or take a few minutes. It always lasted the same length, and it always seemed to come with that flashing light. This didn't feel random. It felt like a routine, like a bus schedule. One night I grew bold and brought a small flashlight. I figured maybe I could shine it through the broken windows and see more. My hands were shaking as I walked up to the perimeter fence. I had my phone's camera ready, but I didn't turn on the flashlight right away. I waited for the hiss. A few minutes passed, and it came. I flicked on my flashlight and aimed it through a large gap in the fence where some chain links were missing. I caught a glimpse of the interior of the station. The ticket counters were covered in dust and debris. The floor had chunks of concrete, probably from the ceiling. Then my beam landed on something near the far corner. It looked like a front grille of an old bus, the kind with a big emblem. The metal was rusted and full of dents. For a second I thought I saw headlights reflecting my flashlight beam, but they were so dull they looked almost painted over. I moved the beam a bit to the left, and I swear I saw a figure in a seat through one of the shattered glass panels on the bus. It wasn't moving. I couldn't make out details, just a silhouette. My breathing became shallow. My flashlight beam started shaking because I couldn't keep my hand steady. Then I heard a click or a snap, like an electrical spark. My flashlight went out. I tried switching it back on, but nothing happened. My phone's battery icon blinked, even though it was at 70% when I left home. I took a few steps back, and as I did, the light inside the station began to flicker violently. It was bright, like a fluorescent tube losing power. It strobed for a few seconds, making the shadows jump around. I tried to steady my nerves. My stomach cramped. I could feel my heart rattling against my ribs. Then the flashing inside stopped. Everything went dark again. I heard a faint scraping, like tires turning on concrete. That's when I lost my nerve. I rushed home without looking back. This pattern continued for weeks. Each time I felt more on edge, like my body was bracing for a confrontation. I stopped sleeping well. Every night I'd replay the images in my head. The silhouette on the bus, the rusted front grille, the flickering lights. I started to wonder if I was hallucinating, but I knew what I saw. It was there. One evening I approached the station from the other side of the block. There was a small alley that gave me a different angle on the property. I noticed a rusty side door hanging off its hinges. It looked like someone had forced it open. I felt a surge of adrenaline. This could be my chance to finally see what was inside. My chest felt tight, and my legs were tense, but I pushed forward. I made sure nobody was watching. Then I slipped into the alley. The smell was strong. Stale urine and rotting trash. I covered my mouth with my sleeve and navigated around a few broken pallets. The side door led to a narrow corridor, probably used by employees back when the station was operational. It was dark, and the floor was cluttered with broken glass and bits of plaster. I had my phone's flashlight this time set to a low beam to avoid drawing too much attention. I moved slowly, each step crunching debris under my shoes. My breathing sounded too loud in my ears. At the end of the corridor there was another door, half open, leading into the main terminal area. I peered inside. Rows of plastic seats were bolted to the floor, many of them cracked. A broken vending machine lay on its side. The air was stale, like an attic that's been sealed up for years. I edged closer to the open doorway, shining my light around. My heart pounded so hard I thought my chest would burst. That's when I heard the hiss again, this time directly to my left. I whipped my phone around and saw what looked like an old tire mark on the floor, curving in from somewhere deeper inside the station. The corridor to the left must have led to the bus parking area. The hiss repeated. It sounded wet, almost like air escaping a pipe. I stepped forward, my body trembling. I followed the sound, moving past rows of rusted lockers and a sign that read, "Employees Only." On the other side of that hallway was a wide set of rolling doors, the kind that opened to let vehicles in. They were partially raised, maybe 3 feet off the ground. I crouched down, shining my phone's light under the gap. That's when I saw the wheels thick and covered in grime, like they belonged to a bus that hadn't moved in decades. I tried to adjust my angle to see more, but the gap was too small. My pulse pounded in my head and sweat dripped down my temple. The hiss came again, and I noticed a quick flicker of light under the bus. It made the wheels cast thin shadows on the concrete. I couldn't move, my chest so tight it hurt to breathe. Then one of the wheels shifted, maybe just an inch, but it was movement. I heard a dull thud, then silence. The flicker of light vanished. My phone started buzzing in my hand, even though I had switched it to silent mode. The screen turned black for a second, and when it came back on, my battery was at 5. I was sure it was nearly full when I entered the alley. I took that as a sign to get out. My gut was screaming at me to leave. I backed away, trying not to make noise. My legs felt weak. When I reached the corridor leading back to the side door, I broke into a run. I didn't care who heard me. My breath came in ragged gasps. I stumbled out into the alley, my phone's battery dying completely. The night air felt cold on my sweaty skin. I kept running until I reached a lit street corner. After that, I couldn't bring myself to go back for a while, but even as I stayed away, I felt this weird longing. I can't explain it. It's like part of me wanted to try again, to see if the bus would fully appear to understand what was happening in that station. Every time night fell, I caught myself thinking about that hissing sound, those flickering lights, that rusted grill. It's like they were calling me, inviting me to take a seat on that broken bus. My rational mind told me it was dangerous, maybe even impossible, but my body reacts whenever I hear a similar sound in the distance. Now, I walk those streets without any plan, just wandering until my legs feel heavy. My eyes keep drifting toward the abandoned station, waiting for that glow, that hiss, that sign that something is about to roll in. The chain link fence still stands, and the barbed wire still loops across the top. But I know there's a break in one of the doors around the side. I know how to get in again, and if I'm being honest, part of me wants to. Every time I pass by, my heart speeds up. I half expect to see headlights swing around the corner, followed by a squeal of tires and a loud release of compressed air. It never happens in full, but the signs are still there. The graffiti changes, the lights flicker, and the station remains empty. Yet, I can shake the feeling that something waits quietly behind those shattered windows, always ready to hiss a warning or maybe an invitation. I don't know how long I'll be able to resist going back. Each night, I linger a little longer, listening for the faint squeal of brakes that never quite materialize. Part of me knows it might be a bad idea to push my luck, but there's this other part of me that can't walk away. There's this pull to see if that bus will ever arrive, if he'll hear a door open, or feel the urge to climb aboard. So far, it's always out of reach, but every night I feel that tingling in my gut, that cold sweat on my neck, reminding me that it's there just waiting, and I can't promise I won't eventually step inside. Maybe I already know I will. I got the job on a Wednesday afternoon. The manager said they needed a night watchman right away. The pay was better than my last gig, so I signed the paperwork without asking too many questions. He told me the building was old and mostly empty at night. I felt a slight chill when I heard him say the place had a few quirks, but I brushed it off. I needed steady money. I didn't ask for details, and he didn't volunteer more information. My first shift started at midnight. The building sat on a quiet street with only a few working streetlights. Most of the windows along the block were dark. The entrance to the building had a single light bulb above the door. Its yellow glow made my skin look sickly. I walked inside, checked in with the small digital system by the door, and followed the manager's instructions to reach the security room. The corridor was dimly lit. My footsteps echoed. It reminded me of vacant offices I'd seen in old movies, except this one smelled like stale paper and coal dust. I found the security room at the end of the hall. It was a cramped space with a single desk, some old monitors, and a binder full of instructions. I flipped through it and saw that it listed each floor in a few specific rooms to check. The building was 4 stories tall, but there were only a handful of tenants using the space for storage. According to the binder, my job was to walk each floor, make sure the lights were off or on, as needed, ensure the doors were locked, and then return to the security room to record the time. That sounded easy. I skimmed the notes about any special conditions. One line stood out. Room 304, keep locked at all times when not in use. I wondered what that meant, but I didn't think much about it. After checking everything on the first round, I came back to the security room and jotted down the times. It was about 2 a.m. when I headed for the second round. By then, I was bored but also a bit uneasy. The hallways had a strange acoustics effect. I could hear every slight movement, every shift of my own clothes. I passed by some offices filled with old filing cabinets and empty shelves. Then I reached the third floor. The overhead lights flickered when I stepped out of the stairwell. The door to room 304 was on my left, near the end of the hallway. I walked toward it. I noticed the door was shut, just as I had left it. I tested the handle to confirm that it was locked. It was secure. A sign on the door said, "Typing pool," which felt outdated. I found that interesting because the binder instructions labeled it room 304, with no mention of typewriters. I shrugged and continued down the hall. When I finished checking the rest of the third floor, I doubled back. This time I heard something that stopped me. The faint tapping of keyboard keys. Except it wasn't the plastic rattle of a modern keyboard. It sounded metallic. I pressed my ear to the door and listened. I heard deliberate clicking like someone typing with focus. Then I heard a pause, followed by the sound of a page being rolled. It was that distinct scraping noise you only get from a typewriter. I tensed up. No one was supposed to be in there. I tried the door again, still locked. The sound came from inside, but it stopped the moment I jiggled the handle. I decided to call the manager, but I hesitated. He had told me to report anything unusual, but I felt silly calling him over a weird noise. I told myself maybe it was some leftover noise from old machinery in the walls. Buildings sometimes make random sounds. I eventually let it go for the moment and continued my rounds. When I got back to the security room, I sat down at the desk and replayed what I'd heard in my head. I felt a creeping tension in my neck. It wasn't painful, just a subtle stiffness that made me feel like something was off. I forced myself to read through more pages in the binder, hoping to find some note about outdated equipment on the third floor. There was nothing. I glanced at the ancient monitors. They showed static images from a few cameras in the hallways and the main entrance. None of them showed anything out of the ordinary. After a while, I convinced myself I'd imagined the noise. On the second night, I felt more alert. I wanted to see if that sound came back. I did my first patrol around midnight. Everything was quiet until I climbed to the third floor again. This time, I stood in front of room 304 for a full minute. No noise. I moved on. 10 minutes later, on my return pass, I heard it again. Click, click, click. Then the dragging sound of a sheet of paper. My stomach dropped. It was the same exact noise. I grabbed my keys and unlocked the door. I pushed it open and switched on the overhead light. The room was large and filled with old wooden tables. On every table there was a typewriter. Some were missing keys. Others were in decent shape. They were all covered in a thin layer of dust. The place smelled musty and stale like old books. I saw nothing moving. The typewriter stood still. No pages in the rollers. I walked around looking for any sign of activity. Then I saw a single sheet of paper lying on one of the tables. The text on it was written in short lines, but I couldn't recognize the language. The letters were unfamiliar. They looked rough with odd curves and sharp edges. I felt a chill run down my arms. I poked the page with my finger. It was real paper, not some trick. I folded it and stuffed it in my pocket. I glanced around one last time, locked the door, and went back downstairs. In the security room, I held the paper under the desk lamp. The words made no sense to me. It wasn't just a foreign language I might guess, like French or Spanish. It looked ancient, or maybe it was coated with something. My heart thumped as I studied it. Then I heard a small creak in the hallway. It sounded like a footstep.
I froze.
The door was open just a crack, so I peered out. Nobody was there. I told myself it was the old floorboard settling. I put the page in my bag, pulled out my phone, and considered calling the manager. But it was late, and I wasn't sure what to say. Hey, I found a bizarre piece of paper in a locked room. That sounded nuts. I decided to wait until morning. When morning came, I left the building quickly. I spent the day thinking about what had happened. I wanted to show the page to someone, but I also worried they'd think I was making it up. I almost convinced myself it was just a leftover document from decades ago. Maybe the building's old typing pool had used some kind of specialized code. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. On the third night, I arrived at the building with a sense of dread. I didn't want to deal with the typewriters again. I did my rounds trying to go fast. Around 1 a.m., the noise returned. It was louder this time. I could make out the repetitive clacking more clearly. I ran to room 304, unlocked it, and stepped inside. Again, the sound vanished, but on each table there was a sheet of paper. I picked up the nearest page. It had the same strange script. Each line was spaced in a neat way like a precise list. I moved to the next table. Same script, different layout. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I looked around, but I saw no one. I started to gather the pages, but I heard something like a soft exhale next to my ear. I spun around. Nothing. My heart pounded. I grabbed all the pages I could see and rushed out. I locked the door and stood in the hallway, breathing hard. My hands shook. I held the pages close to my chest. I went back to the security room and threw the pages onto the desk. I paced in front of the monitors. Then I heard a small scraping sound behind me, like someone dragging a foot across the floor. I whirled around. The door was shut. I felt the hair on my arm stand up. I sat down, tried to focus, and told myself to breathe slowly. The pages were still there, covered in letters I didn't understand. My mind raced with questions. Was someone sneaking in? Were these pages appearing by themselves? It felt impossible. The next few nights followed the same pattern. I'd hear typing on the third floor. I'd open the door, find fresh pages, and sense a presence behind me. I checked for hidden cameras. I checked for vents or secret entrances. The walls and floor looked solid. Nothing explained these sounds or these pages. By the fifth night, I stopped trying to pick up the papers. They multiplied every time I visited. Sometimes I'd see 3 or 4, other times I'd see a dozen. They always had those odd symbols. I felt like a lab rat in a maze with no way out. My sleep schedule was ruined by then. During the day, I'd stare at the pages in my apartment. I'd search the internet for any sign of a similar script. I didn't find anything. It wasn't any known alphabet I could discover. After hours of searching, I gave up. At work, I started feeling paranoid. I kept looking over my shoulder. I heard quiet breaths and faint shuffling noises in empty halls. I'd rush around corners hoping to catch whoever it was, but I saw no one. By the second week, I considered quitting. The money was good though, and I doubted I could explain the situation to anyone. One afternoon, I tried to confront the manager. I told him I was hearing weird things at night, and I asked if the building had any old machines running. He looked puzzled and just shrugged. He said something about the building having a long history, but he didn't seem concerned. That night, the tension grew worse. Around 2 a.m., I was sitting in the security room, flipping through the binder again. I heard a sudden urgent rattling noise from the hallway. It was like someone hitting a door handle trying to get in. I jumped up. My pulse raced. I opened the door. The hallway was empty. I moved slowly toward the stairwell, checking each office door as I passed. All of them were locked. Then I heard typing again. This time, it sounded frantic. I didn't want to go into room. I really didn't, but I felt drawn to it. I walked down the hall, each step heavy. When I reached the door, I stood still, listening to the chaotic clacking. My mouth went dry. I slipped the key into the lock and turned it. I pushed the door open and flipped on the light. The typing stopped mid-sound. In front of me, every single typewriter had a page in it. I saw keys raised as if they'd just been pressed. My legs felt weak. The typewriters sat there silent. I took a step forward and I heard a short, raspy breath near my right ear. I spun around. No one was there. I felt a wave of panic. My body felt clammy. My shirt stuck to my back. I wanted to run, but my legs were locked. I forced myself to move, checking each table. The pages were covered in text again, but some had large ink blotches. They looked fresh, still glistening under the fluorescent light. I reached out to touch one blotch. It was cold and wet. I pulled my hand back, disgusted. I looked around, unsure what to do. The room felt charged, like the air was heavier. My skin tingled. I turned to leave. As I did, I heard the slightest scrape of a typewriter key behind me. I rushed into the hallway, slammed the door, and locked it. I stood there, panting, pressing my forehead against the wall. For the rest of the night, I stayed in the security room. I tried to distract myself by reading old logs. I found entries from previous guards, but they didn't mention anything unusual. Either they never encountered this, or they chose not to write it down. Time dragged on. I kept looking at the clock, counting minutes until sunrise. Every small sound made me jump. I felt like the walls were closing in on me. My shoulders were stiff, and my mouth tasted like copper. By dawn, I was a mess. I turned off the monitors, grabbed my bag, and headed out. I didn't even bother to log my final round. I'm still working there. It's been a few more nights of the same routine. Sometimes the typewriters are silent, and I spend the night expecting them to start up again. Other times I find more pages with the strange text on them. The presence behind me is always the same, a faint breath or a slight shuffle. It's never more than a few seconds, but it's enough to set my nerves on edge. I haven't told anyone else. I haven't quit yet. I stare at those pages in my apartment every day, but I don't know what they mean. They feel wrong in my hands, like they carry a message not meant for me. I can't explain the sense of being watched. It hovers around me, not only in room 30 or 4, but in every corner of the building. I sometimes look at the old monitors hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever is in there. I never do. The cameras only show dusty hallways and flickering lights. But I still hear typing at odd hours, and I still find new pages when I wake up. When I try to read them, I feel that cold breath by my ear, as if warning me not to look too closely. My heart pounds every time I touch one of those sheets, but I keep collecting them. I'm questioning whether any of this is real or if it's all in my head. But I can't ignore the pages piling up in my closet at home. They're proof that something happens in that room. I can't bring myself to destroy them, and I can't stop them from appearing. Night after night, I do my rounds, check the locks, and wait for the typing to start. I wish it would stop, but I also feel drawn to it, like I need to see it through. For now, I keep going back, listening to the clicks and carriage returns, waiting for a face to appear behind me. It never does. Yet, I sense it there, breathing, watching, and leaving words it'll never understand. I got off the bus in the late afternoon and walked down the main street. I saw a few people carrying groceries or sitting outside small shops, but they barely looked at me. The pension was at the far end of town, right next to a stretch of old train tracks. It was a modest place, painted a faded green with a creaky wooden porch and a squeaky screen door. As I approached, I felt a chill in the air, even though the sun was still up. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just wanted a room, a hot meal, and a place to rest for a couple of days. I walked in and greeted the woman behind the counter. She handed me a key and pointed me upstairs. I thanked her, logged my bag up the narrow staircase, and found my room at the end of the hall. Once I settled in, I opened the window to get some air. The curtains were dusty, and the hinges on the window frame creaked. Outside, I could see the abandoned railroad tracks about 30 yards from the building. Reeds and tall grass had grown up around the rails, and rust covered the metal. It looked like no train had passed there for decades. A sense of stillness hung over the place, and I found it strangely peaceful. I unpacked a few things, washed my face in the tiny sink, and then went downstairs to ask about dinner. The woman said they served simple meals in the small dining area at the back. I smelled something like stew or soup cooking. I thanked her and grabbed a seat at one of the old wooden tables. While I waited, I heard two older men talking a couple of tables over. They were discussing a time when the station used to be busy. One man said he missed the sound of the trains, while the other shook his head and muttered something about the tracks being better off left alone. I didn't want to interrupt, so I stayed quiet and listened. After a few minutes, dinner was ready, and I focused on my meal. The stew was hearty and warm, which felt good after the long bus ride. Later, I decided to head up to my room early and get some rest. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound that cut through the silence. It was a distant train whistle. I heard it again, a low, mournful note. It lasted a few seconds and then faded. I lay there, uncertain if I was dreaming. I listened harder. The night air was still. But then I heard the whistle one more time, even clearer. It sounded like it was coming from the direction of the abandoned tracks. I got out of bed, my heart pounding. I opened the window wider and looked outside. The grass stirred in a sudden breeze. There was no train out there, just darkness. Yet the whistle kept coming every few minutes. It never got closer, but it never went away. Finally, I closed the window, sat on the edge of the bed, and wondered if I should go take a look. I felt a pull, like a strange urge to go see what was making that noise, but I didn't move. Instead, I waited until the whistle stopped, then dozed off again. In the morning, I asked the woman at the desk about the sound. She gave me a puzzled look. I told her I'd heard a train whistle. She said there hadn't been a train on those tracks since the night. Another guest, a middle-aged man sipping coffee, said I was probably hearing the wind in the trees. I knew what I'd heard. It wasn't the wind, but I shrugged it off. I decided not to push the topic. I spent the day wandering around the small town, checking out the local diner, a hardware store, and a little library on the corner. People seemed friendly enough, though a bit wary of outsiders. At least 2 different folks brought up the tracks when I mentioned where I was staying. They always said something along the lines of, "You won't see any trains there anymore." That night, I went to bed early again. I tried to read a paperback I'd brought, but I kept glancing at the clock. Midnight came, and I felt tense anticipation. Right on cue, I heard the whistle, farther away than before, but still distinct. I sat up and waited. My palms were sweating. I realized I wanted to hear it again, as if I needed some proof I wasn't going crazy. When it sounded again, I jumped to my feet, grabbed my jacket, and left my room. I walked downstairs, past the darkened lobby, and out the front door. The night air was cold enough to make me shiver. I looked toward the tracks. A faint glow hovered over them like a light moving along the rails. I walked closer. My heart thumped in my chest. The whistle blared one more time, then quieted. I saw what looked like lanterns bobbing along the tracks, but I saw no train. There were only these shifting lights, drifting in the darkness. I heard the door of the pension creak behind me. One of the older men from earlier stepped out onto the porch. He asked me what I was doing. I told him I was trying to see if there really was a train. He stared at the tracks, shook his head, and told me to come inside. He didn't offer an explanation, and I didn't push him. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. My mind kept going back to those lights. Over the next few days, I felt a growing urge to explore more of the tracks, especially near the old station. I heard from a local that the station was a half-mile walk down the line. I asked if it was safe to go there. The person shrugged and said it was deserted, but intact. So, late the next afternoon, I decided to head out. The sun was setting, and the sky was orange and purple. I walked along the rusted rails, stepping over loose ties and weeds. My boots crunched on gravel. In the distance, I saw the outline of a small building with a collapsed roof on one side. That must have been the station. The windows were boarded up, but the door was ajar. I pushed it open. Hinges creaked. Inside, I saw a few broken chairs, an overturned table, and scattered papers on the floor. Dust covered everything, and the air smelled stale. I didn't spend much time there. I felt uneasy. The corners were dark, and my flashlight only helped so much. I left after a few minutes, promising myself I'd come back in daylight. That night, right around midnight, the wind picked up. It rattled the windows of my room so hard that I thought they might break. I sat up in bed and felt my heart racing. The whistle started again, louder than before. My skin prickled. I got dressed in a hurry, put on my coat, and grabbed a flashlight. I left my room and hurried downstairs. The lobby was empty. I stepped outside. The wind whipped my hair around, and I had to brace myself against it. The air felt colder than usual, and my breath came out in foggy bursts. I turned on my flashlight and pointed it toward the tracks. I saw the same glowing lights moving along the rails, but they were closer now. They seemed to drift in my direction, then fade, then appear again. I heard the whistle once more, and it sounded like it was coming from right down the line. I walked toward the lights. My shoes sank into soft dirt near the tracks. My mind was spinning with questions, but I kept going. I wanted to see if a train would appear. I wanted to see if there was some trick, or if people were playing a prank. But nobody else was out there. I was alone. The whistle blasted again. It was so loud I covered my ears. My flashlight flickered. The lights on the rails grew brighter, then disappeared. I stood there breathing heavily, waiting for something to happen. The wind died down a little, but I was shivering so hard I could barely hold the flashlight steady. After a few minutes I heard only silence, and felt only the cold night air. I turned around and went back inside. The next morning, I tried asking around town if anyone had seen the lights or heard the whistle. Some people just gave me a blank stare. A few told me to mind my own business. One person, a store clerk, said I wasn't the first outsider to talk about it. She said some travelers claimed to hear trains at night, but no one had a solid explanation. I felt a mix of frustration and curiosity. Part of me wanted to leave. Part of me felt compelled to stay until I could figure out what was going on. That evening I decided to stay up and watch from my window. I left the light off in my room so I could see outside better. Midnight came, and the whistle echoed through the darkness. This time I noticed the glass in my window trembling with each blast. My heart pounded. I could feel sweat on my forehead, but my body felt cold. I saw the lights moving along the tracks again, slowly, almost like they were searching for something. Then the wind kicked up. The curtains behind me fluttered. I grabbed my jacket, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scene outside. The lights stopped just a few yards from the pension. I saw the silhouette of something, but I couldn't make it out clearly. Then the whistle blared and the lights vanished. No train, no figures, just me, shaking in my room. The following day, I convinced myself I needed to see the station at night. I waited until about 11 p.m. and then headed out with a flashlight. I followed the tracks, stepping carefully to avoid loose gravel and uneven ground. When I reached the old station, I noticed the door was completely off its hinges now. It lay on the floor inside. The boards on the windows had shifted, leaving gaps. The wind whistled through those gaps, making a low moaning sound. I stood in the middle of the station, feeling uneasy. I saw a few old timetables on the wall, faded and torn. I shone my flashlight across the room, spotting a cracked mirror leaning against a corner. My reflection looked pale. I felt my pulse hammer in my ears. Right at midnight, the whistle blared again so loud it made my chest tighten. I ran outside, forgetting everything else. The lights approaching from the far end of the tracks were heading toward the station. I felt a strong urge to step forward, as if something was pulling me closer. My breath came in short gasps. I thought maybe I would finally see the shape of the train. The lights drew nearer, bright and steady. The rail ties vibrated under my feet. Then I felt a sharp drop in temperature. My eyes watered in the cold air. The lights got so bright I had to shield my eyes. I waited for the roar of an engine or the clacking of wheels, but I heard nothing except that deafening whistle. I backed away, my flashlight shaking in my hand. A swirl of dust rose around the station platform. The windows rattled. My entire body tensed. I thought the lights were going to barrel right into me, but they stopped a few feet away. They hovered there, flickering. I couldn't see any train cars, no metal, no wheels, no engine, just these lights. Then, the whistle cut out, leaving a thick silence in its place. My ears rang. My face felt numb. I stood there for maybe a minute, unsure what to do. The lights slowly began to fade, like embers dying out. I looked around and everything felt heavy. The urge to get closer still tugged at me, but fear rooted me to the spot. Eventually the lights vanished, and I was left standing alone in the dark. When I got back to the pension, it was close to 1 a.m. I closed my door quietly and sank onto the bed, heart still pounding. My thoughts were racing. I felt scared, but I also felt a strange excitement. I kept asking myself what I just witnessed. I wondered what would happen if those lights actually arrived at the station, but something step off. Would it be a real train? I didn't sleep much that night. Over the next couple of days I stuck around, half hoping the whistle would stop and half hoping I'd get some kind of resolution. Each night, the wind grew stronger, and the whistle got louder. A few times I thought the windows might shatter from the vibrations. I couldn't keep still. I paced my room until I heard the whistle. Then I dashed outside and stood near the tracks. The lights always danced in the distance, never forming a solid shape. Sometimes they teased me by coming close only to pull back. Other times, they stayed far away, just out of reach. On my last night there, I sat on the porch of the pension with a blanket around my shoulders. The temperature dropped sharply as midnight approached. The whistle cut through the air, and I felt the familiar rush of tension. My hands trembled. My mouth went dry. I watched the lights appear down the line, flickering in and out. I forced myself to stay put, even though my heart was telling me to run to the station. I could see the tall grass bending in the wind, the rust on the tracks, and the faint glow that seemed to float above the rails. For a moment I wondered if I should leave town in the morning. But a bigger part of me wanted to see what would happen if that phantom train ever reached this spot. I can't explain why I felt that way. It was like a magnet pulling me closer, night after night, despite the fear that gripped my chest. I still don't know if a real train will ever show up, or if those lights and whistles will keep me on edge forever. The townspeople don't talk about it much, and they don't seem to care whether I find answers or not. As I sit here recalling every detail, I feel that cold breeze on my face again. I hear that distant whistle ringing in my ears. It's midnight now, and I can sense the wind picking up. The windows are rattling, and my breath is catching in my throat. I can see faint lights outside, moving along the tracks, coming closer every minute. I'm not sure what I'll do when they arrive at the station, if they ever truly arrive at all. But I can't stop looking. I can stop listening. And I can shake the feeling that sooner or later I might see more than just lights. I might hear that train pull in, right beside this old pension. And when that happens, I'll be standing there waiting, even if my hands are shaking and my heart's about burst through my chest. I got a call about a month ago. A lawyer told me that my distant uncle, a man I barely remembered, left me a collection of rare books. The news felt unexpected, but I didn't want to turn down something that sounded interesting. I arrived at his old house 2 weeks later, signed a few documents, and hauled away a heavy oak bookshelf packed with dusty tomes. I didn't spend much time looking through them initially. I stacked them in my living room, figuring I would inspect them piece by piece when I had more energy. Then I noticed one book with a strange binding. Its cover looked smooth, and the pages made a soft noise when I flipped them. It sounded like a faint melody. I felt a slight tingle on my fingertips whenever I touched that book. I remember thinking it was probably my imagination, but I kept going back to it. Everything else sat untouched. That's how it all started. When I got the bookshelf home, I placed it against the wall in my study. The rest of the house was quiet. I live alone in a small place with plain furniture and a simple layout. My study is just a wooden desk, a rolling chair, and a lamp. I don't keep many decorations around. I like neat spaces, and I like to have a clear view of what's in front of me. That night, I set the special book on my desk. I leaned back in my chair and opened it. The pages looked old, almost brittle, but I could flip them without too much trouble. As I did that, I heard a soft sound. It reminded me of a music box, but it wasn't loud or annoying. It felt calming at first. The title page had some faded text in Latin. I couldn't read much, but I recognized certain words like tempus and porta. I flipped a few pages, and the sound got slightly louder. It was still gentle, so I didn't feel alarmed or anything. I ran my finger along the lines of text, trying to make sense of them. I didn't get very far, but I felt some odd sensation in my chest. It wasn't pain. It was more like a tightness, as though my lungs wanted me to breathe deeper. I put the book aside and decided to get some rest. That night, I slept just fine. The second night, I sat at my desk again. The rest of the house was dark, except for a small lamp next to me. The special book lay closed in front of me. I opened it, and the melody started again. It was slow and simple, but it pulled at my attention. I found myself humming along without realizing it. Then I noticed that the pages seemed to shift on their own if I let go. It was subtle, but it felt like the paper had a slight current running through it, causing them to settle on certain paragraphs. I tilted my head, feeling a small jolt in my fingertips, like static electricity. I turned more pages, and the melody shifted in pitch. My throat felt dry. I swallowed and decided to read a bit more. I don't know Latin well, but I tried pronouncing a few of the words out loud. I stumbled over them, but each time I said a phrase, the melody swelled for a moment. I stopped talking, and it faded back to a low hum. My heart started beating faster. I felt beads of sweat forming on my forehead. It wasn't hot in the room. I had the window open, and a cool breeze came in. But my body felt tense. My chest felt like it was vibrating. I closed the book, stood up, and walked away. I needed a glass of water. I drank it in the kitchen, staring at the wall and trying to slow my breathing. Nothing else in the house seemed strange. I just felt uneasy, as if there was something watching me. But I live alone, so I figured I was just spooked. I shook it off and went to bed. On the third night, the melody grew stronger. I started hearing it the moment I opened my study door. The book was shut on the desk, but the sound was already there, like someone had left a radio on low volume. My stomach tensed up. I approached the desk and reached out to touch the cover. The melody rose in volume for a second. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I felt a chill run down my arms. I opened the book and watched the pages flicker. I saw faint movement around the edges of the paper. It was like a ripple. I rubbed my eyes, but it didn't stop. I tried to ignore it. I flipped through a few pages. The text was in Old Latin, full of words I couldn't place. A few lines repeated on different pages. I tried sounding them out. "A unwind," I said quietly. My voice trembled. The melody turned into a drawn-out hum that seemed to swirl around my ears. I felt something on my shoulder, like fingers pressing gently. I spun around, but no one was there. The pressure stayed there, though, making my skin crawl. I slammed the book shut and ran my hand over my face. My palms felt clammy, and my mouth felt dry again. I forced myself to stand still, but my knees felt weak. Finally, I grabbed the book and slid it into a drawer. I turned off the light and left the room. I didn't sleep well that night. Over the next few days, the book seemed to move on its own. I found it on the desk when I was sure I had left it in the drawer. A few times, I placed it on a shelf with other volumes, only to find it open on my desk the next day. Each time it was open, the pages pointed to that same Latin text. One phrase repeated, "Aperi Januam." I looked it up on my phone. It meant open the door. I tried ignoring this, but I tried focusing on my regular life, like going to work, buying groceries, and cleaning the house. But every evening, I heard that faint melody as soon as I walked through the door. I started feeling pressure in my chest at random times. My arms tingled. At night, I sometimes heard faint whispers in the hallway, but I couldn't make out words. My house felt colder, even though the weather outside was pretty warm. I wore a jacket around the house, but it didn't help much. My breath sometimes turned ragged when I got close to the study. My head ached, and I thought about getting some sleep aids or seeing a doctor, but I kept telling myself it was just stress. On the fifth night, I sat in the living room watching TV with the lights on. I had the volume high enough to block out any noise from the study. The remote was in my hand, and I was trying to relax. Around midnight, the TV screen flickered for a second. I tried changing the channel, but the screen kept flickering. Then I noticed a melody behind me coming from the hallway. My muscles tightened, and I set the remote control down. I stood up, my legs feeling stiff. I walked toward the study following that humming sound. I found the door slightly open, even though I had closed it earlier. I pushed it open and saw the book in the center of the desk. It was open, and the pages were fluttering, like someone was turning them. I heard the paper rustling, but the fan was off, and the window was shut. Nothing else was moving in the room. I stepped closer, and the melody got clearer. I felt that familiar pressure on my shoulder, like a hand guiding me. My heart thumped so hard that I felt a pulse in my temples. I leaned down to read the text. The words were bold, and I recognized that same Latin phrase. I sat down, feeling a dull ache in my lower back. The seat of the chair felt cold. I tried to read the passage without stumbling. "Aperian wam, avians ed, ignudum." I messed up the rest, but I kept trying. My hands shook. The melody swelled, and I felt like someone was behind me, breathing over my neck. My scalp prickled. I stopped reading and looked around. The room was dim, with the lamp casting sharp shadows on the walls. I heard a faint creaking noise by the corner near the bookshelf. My eyes felt dry, and I blinked a few times. I picked up the book and held it in my hands. The pages vibrated under my thumbs. I stood up and tried leaving the room. The melody seemed to follow me, echoing down the hall. I went to my bedroom and shut the door. I could still hear it, but it was quieter. I placed the book on my nightstand, not knowing why I even brought it with me. I sat on the bed and stared at the cover. My breathing stayed shallow, loose. My hands felt numb. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that weird pressure on my arms or a slight tug at the sheet. I would jolt away, convinced that someone was there. When I got up in the morning, I saw the book open on the bed next to me. I don't remember opening it. I shoved it into the closet and slammed the door shut. Over the next few days, I tried to avoid the study. I kept the book in the closet, but I heard the melody at random times. Sometimes I heard it when I was showering or when I was about to leave for work. It was never loud. It was more like a distant humming that seeped into my ears. My appetite got worse. My head felt heavy all the time. I started checking around the house for any hidden speakers or weird devices. I found nothing. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something in that book wanted me to keep reading it. On the 8th night, I felt a strong urge to open it again. My hands were shaky, my skin felt cold, the house felt stuffy, and I could smell old paper everywhere, like a dusty library. I walked to the closet and pulled open the door. The book was on the floor, not where I had placed it. I bent down and picked it up. The cover felt warm against my fingers. The melody began immediately. I carried it to the living room and sat on the couch. I opened it and saw more text in Latin. Some words looked different from before, as if the letters had rearranged themselves. I tried sounding them out. The melody rose in intensity and my lungs felt tight. My eyes watered. My neck stiffened. As I read each line, I felt a strange vibration in my jaw, like my teeth were rattling. The words sounded harsh and guttural, but I kept going. The book's pages seemed to glow under the ceiling light. The corners shone with a faint shimmer. My heart pounded, and my shirt clung to my back from sweat. I leaned forward and followed each sentence. I tried to keep my voice steady. My lips felt dry, and my tongue almost stuck to the roof of my mouth. A numb sensation crept up my calves, and my ankles felt locked in place. Then I heard a rustling behind me. I turned my head quickly, but there was only the lamp on the end table and a blank wall. Yet, I felt something shift the couch cushion beside me. I jumped up, breathing hard. The book slid off my lap onto the floor. The melody soared, and I felt a gust of cold air blow across the room. My hair whipped across my forehead. I covered my face with my arm, trying to protect my eyes from the sudden draft. When I looked again, the room was still. The melody had dropped to a low hum. My heart hammered inside my ribcage, and my mouth hung open in shock. I reached for the book on the floor, which had landed face down but showed no torn pages. I placed it back on the couch. The humming seemed to pulse. My ears rang, and I felt dizzy. I forced my legs to move. I took the book and walked back to the study. I wanted to lock it up. I opened a desk drawer, placed the book inside, then locked it. My pulse was still racing, and I could feel sweat on my upper lip. My eyes darted around the room. Everything else looked normal. I backed out of the study and closed the door, leaving the light on behind me. That night I tried to ignore the sounds, but they didn't stop. The melody came through the walls, and I heard a scratching noise near the study door. I paced the hallway, running my hand through my hair and wiping my forehead. My body felt tense, as if I was ready to run. I kept telling myself to calm down. I turned on every light in the house and made sure no windows were open. I tried calling a friend, but it went to voicemail. I felt alone. My hands shook every time I heard that scratching. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady my breath. When it got too intense, I marched into the study and yanked the drawer open. The lock was broken. The book lay open, with pages turning on their own. I reached out to slam it shut, and that melody cut through my head. My ears buzzed, and my eyes watered, but I forced the cover closed. My chest felt like it was in a vise. I could barely breathe. I stared at the locked drawer. The latch was snapped clean off. I don't know how that happened. My body was shaking so badly that I could barely stand. I grabbed a roll of duct tape from a toolbox by my desk, wrapped it around the book, sealing it shut. Then I shoved it back in the drawer and taped the drawer shut as well. My heart pounded, and my breath came in short bursts. I stayed like that for a while, crouched by the desk. The house felt silent again, except for the blood rushing in my ears. My palms were clammy against my knees. I wiped them on my jeans. Eventually I stood up and left the study. I wanted to keep going, but my head throbbed, and I felt exhausted. I collapsed onto my bed, fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling. The house was quiet now, but I knew it wouldn't last. That's where things stand. I can still feel a faint vibration in the air. I don't sleep much anymore, but I haven't heard the melody in the last hour. It might start up again any moment. I'm not sure what the book wants or what will happen if I keep reading it, but I don't want to find out. For now, I'm just sitting here feeling my pulse slow down, while I keep my eyes on the study door. If I hear that melody again, I'll try to ignore it, but I don't know how long I can hold out. I started that restoration job thinking it would be straightforward. I expected dust, old paint flakes, and a lot of elbow grease, but nothing out of the ordinary. On my first day in the gallery, I walked through the main hall with a checklist in hand. The manager showed me the chipped frames and the peeling corners of several murals. He gave me a rundown of the tasks and I felt confident. I've done this type of work for years and I've seen my share of faded masterpieces. I had no reason to feel anxious, but on the third day, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. One painting on the far wall didn't have a single layer of dust on it. That caught my attention right away because every other piece in that wing looked neglected. My eyes locked onto this painting surface. It was spotless. The colors looked as if they were still drying. The rest of the hall was covered in gray film, but this one painting stood out like it had just been unwrapped. I took a step closer and felt a slight shiver in my gut. The painting showed a single figure standing in a foggy landscape. The background was dull, mostly shades of gray and white. The figure wore a dark coat. I couldn't see the figure's face well. The brushstrokes where the face should have been looked blurred or maybe smudged. I leaned in and tried to see if the painter used a special technique, but I didn't notice anything obvious. I rubbed my hand along the frame and then looked at my fingers. They were clean. No dust, no dirt, no old paint flakes. That was strange. I inspected the glass covering next. It was crystal clear, without so much as a fingerprint. The next morning, I decided to try cleaning it with a soft cloth and a mild solution. I thought maybe it had some protective coat that repelled dirt, but the cloth came away just the same way it went in, completely clean, not a single speck. I ran a finger along the surface of the painting and felt nothing, no grit, no texture that suggested a sealer or fresh varnish. The paint felt smooth, more like plastic than oil. It gave me an uncomfortable feeling. I told myself it might just be well maintained. Maybe the gallery staff wiped it regularly. Yet that explanation didn't fit. The rest of the paintings were in rough shape. It didn't add up. I continued my restoration tasks for the day, focusing on a massive mural across the hall. But every few minutes I glanced over at that painting. The figure's stance seemed to change slightly each time I looked. I assumed it was my imagination. When I work long hours, my eyes sometimes play tricks on me. I shrugged it off. But later, while I was brushing dust off a sculpture, I smelled a weird, sweet odor. I tracked it to that painting. It was like a faint whiff of sugar mixed with something sour. I stood there sniffing the air, feeling unsettled. The painting was about 6 feet off the ground, so I got on a small step stool and leaned my face toward the canvas. The smell was stronger. It made my stomach twist. I backed away and decided to bring it up with the manager the next day. That evening I stayed late to finish documenting some cracks in the plaster of the ceiling. The lights in the gallery were on a timer, so after 9 only a few overhead fixtures stayed lit. The painting hung in the dim part of the room. As I gathered my tools, I noticed a faint glow near the painting. It could have been a reflection from one of the exit signs or an emergency light, but it seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. I took a couple of steps closer, then I heard a soft, wet sound, almost like a slow drip. I stopped in front of the painting. The figure's edges looked sharper, the coat seemed heavier, and the outline of a face was more defined. I held my flashlight up and studied it. Then, I lightly touched the surface. It vibrated under my fingertips, a slight tremor that made my hand jerk back. My heart thumped in my chest, and I felt beads of sweat forming on my forehead. I shoved my things into my bag and left right away. The next morning, I sat in my car outside the gallery, staring at the entrance. I felt tense, as if someone had punched me in the gut. I inhaled, thinking maybe I was being dramatic. I told myself to act normal and do my job. I walked in, greeted the manager, and headed straight to that painting. I wanted to see it in the daytime. The room was bright, with sunlight coming in through the tall windows. This time, the painting's colors looked more vibrant than before. The figure wore the same coat, but there was a new detail. A small black mark on the person's chest. It looked like a pin or a brooch. I didn't remember seeing that the previous day. I leaned in and squinted, trying to figure out if I just missed it, but the lines were so clear it looked freshly painted. I stepped back, blinking. The sweet odor returned stronger than ever, making me feel lightheaded. I decided to clean it again, more aggressively this time. I gathered a stronger cleaning solution and a sponge. I sprayed the solution on the surface and started scrubbing lightly. Nothing happened. The paint didn't bleed. The sponge stayed clean. I tried applying more pressure. The painting remained perfect. No flakes, no residue. It was like the painting was sealed in glass. But there was no glass. Then, I heard a faint scraping noise that I couldn't place. It sounded like something rubbing against wood coming from inside the wall. My arms broke out in goosebumps. I switched to a dry cloth and wiped every inch of the frame, the edges, and the wall. Still nothing. I walked away feeling a little shaky. Throughout the week, I kept working on other pieces, but my eyes drifted toward that painting every chance they got. The figure in the painting seemed to move positions by small degrees. One day, the figure's coat collar appeared flipped up. Another day, the figure's posture looked different, like it was leaning slightly forward. Each time I noticed a change, my stomach tightened. I started feeling uneasy around the other artwork too, but none of them showed anything as strange. Some still had layers of dirt that I had to wipe away, and that felt normal. Only that single piece remained untouched by time. By Friday afternoon, I felt exhausted. My back hurt from climbing ladders, and my fingers were cramped from handling brushes and sponges all day. The gallery was about to close, but I decided to take one more look at the suspicious painting. The overhead lights flickered a bit as I approached. I saw that black mark on the figure's chest again, bigger now. It wasn't just a pin, it had grown into a small circle, almost like a stain on the coat. I shook my head and rubbed my eyes. The sweet smell hit me once more. It made my throat itch, and I coughed a few times before leaning in. The circle looked wet. Tiny beads of liquid formed around its edges, shining in the light. I placed a finger on that spot. The paint felt warm, which made me yank my hand away. I froze. I watched as that wet spot pulsed like it had a rhythm. My chest felt tight, and I forgot to breathe for a second. Then, in a surge of panic, I grabbed my supply card and wheeled it over. I set up a portable lamp to get a better view. I touched the spot again with the tip of a cotton swab. The swab came back sticky with a red-brown substance. My heart pounded so hard I could feel my pulse in my neck. I felt a cold sweat on my back. I stared at that swab, then flicked it into the trash. I didn't want to think about what that substance might be. My hands trembled. I could barely pack up my equipment. I left the gallery as fast as I could. That night I didn't sleep well. I tossed and turned, replaying the image of that wet spot over and over in my head. The next morning was Saturday, and the gallery was closed to the public, but I had a key for after-hours work. I arrived at around 10:00 in the morning and found the manager's office empty. I left a note saying I had to do some final touches. I went straight to the painting. I was determined to figure out what was going on. This time the black circle was larger, about the size of a quarter, and the figure's face was more visible. I could see vague outlines of eyes and a mouth. The face looked like it was pressed against something from inside. I caught a glimpse of movement under the paint layer. It was slight, like a twitch. A shiver ran through my arms. I looked behind me, half expecting someone to be there. Nobody was around. The gallery's old floors creaked with every step. The air smelled stale except for that sweet odor lingering around the painting. I took a deep breath and told myself to stay calm. Then I noticed a subtle vibration in the frame. It felt like a heartbeat under my hands. I grabbed a small flathead screwdriver, intending to pry the painting from the wall and check the back. I wedged the tip under the frame's edge and pushed. The frame wouldn't budge. It felt like it was fused to the wall. I pressed harder and something made a clicking noise like a latch. Then the painting twitched. I jumped back, dropping the screwdriver. The painting's surface rippled. I saw the brushstrokes shift, and the figure's coat seemed to flutter for a second. My face went hot and my muscles tensed. I yanked at the corner of the frame with both hands, pulling as hard as I could. Finally, I felt a tiny give, maybe 1/8 of an inch. Then a hiss sounded, like air escaping. The sweet smell rushed at me, stronger than before. My throat closed up and I doubled over, coughing. My eyes watered. I stumbled back, nearly falling. I steadied myself against a pedestal. The painting let out a low creak as if the wood was bending on its own. I stared, my heart pounding, wanting to leave but also wanting answers. My mind raced. I grabbed a heavier scraper from my cart and wedged it between the frame and the wall. I forced it in deeper. The sound of wood splitting made my heart skip a beat. I kept pushing, ignoring the panic in my head. The sudden rush of warm air hit my face. I heard a slushy, wet sound. The painting's surface warped, pushing outward, like something was trying to break through. My arms shook and sweat dripped down my temples. I pulled the scraper out, letting out a shaky breath. I wiped the sweat off my forehead and glanced at the painting again. The figure's head looked turned toward me now. I saw the faint outline of eyes, almost as if they were focusing on my face. I felt dizzy. My jaw clenched and my shoulders were stiff. I stepped back and gripped the scraper tightly, holding it tight. My heart hammered. I wanted to run, but I forced myself to stay put. I inched toward it again, trying to see if the hole behind the frame was big enough to reveal anything. I reached behind with one hand and felt around. The wall was cold and I felt some kind of dampness. My fingers came away covered in a sticky red-brown film. I gasped and dropped the scraper. I wiped my hand on a rag. My stomach twisted in knots. My breathing was ragged. I stared at the painting and it seemed to stare back. I couldn't tell if it was just the shifting brushstrokes or if there was an actual presence behind that canvas. My mouth felt dry. I gripped the rag in one hand, feeling my nails dig into my palm. I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed my things and rushed toward the exit. My legs felt weak, and each step felt heavier than the last. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears I could barely hear anything else. I made it out to the parking lot and slammed my car door behind me. I sat there for several minutes, shaking hands on the steering wheel. I stared at the gallery building, fighting the urge to drive off and never come back. My phone sat in the passenger seat. I could have called the manager, but what would I even say? I didn't have logical proof of anything. Everything felt insane. After a while, I started the engine and left. I didn't return that weekend. I spent 2 days pacing around my apartment, checking my phone for calls from the gallery. There were none. My appetite was shot. I kept thinking about that sticky substance and the shifting figure. I couldn't figure out a rational explanation. On Monday, I got a text from the manager asking if I was coming to finish the job. I stared at the message, my hands sweating. I typed back, "You'll be in this afternoon." I didn't know what else to do. I had to go back and at least collect my equipment. When I arrived, I found the manager in the main hall. He looked annoyed. He said they had sealed off that wing because there was a strange odor leaking through the walls, and he didn't want visitors complaining. He asked if I had any idea what was causing it. I just shook my head and tried to look calm. Then he led me to the wing, unlocked the door, and let me enter alone. The smell was still there, a sickening sweetness that made me gag. I walked over to the painting. It was covered with a sheet of plastic. The manager said he'd had to hide it because it was causing some staff members to feel nauseous. I peeled the plastic back an inch. Underneath, I saw the painting surface. It looked normal, no bulge or ripple. The figure still had that black circle on its chest, but it wasn't seeping. It looked dry. I felt the same fear return, my throat tight. I told the manager I'd wrap up my tools and check the walls for mold. He left me alone again. I hurried to my supply closet and gathered everything. Then I made one last pass by the painting. I lifted the plastic sheet fully and looked at it head on. The figure's face was shadowed, but I swore the eyes shifted slightly. The odor was thick around me. My palms were clammy, and my pulse drummed in my head. A slight tremor passed through the painting, enough to make a faint rustle. I stepped back and lowered the plastic gently. I felt relief once I couldn't see the painting anymore. I turned around and left. I didn't speak to anyone about that painting after that. I told the manager I couldn't finish the restoration in that wing, citing health concerns. He accepted my resignation for that part of the job, and I moved on to another project in a different part of the city. I still think about that painting sometimes. The spotless surface, the quiet changes, the sweet smell, the sticky fluid. I haven't found a logical reason for how it resisted time or why it seemed to shift like it was alive. I never want to see it again, but at times I imagine it still hanging on that wall, rejecting every speck of dust, pulsing behind the canvas, waiting for someone else to notice, and that thought keeps me up at night.